A sham marriage signed in 15 minutes, a multi-billion-dollar empire at stake, and a little girl's life. Ethan Hale walks into the office expecting to be fired. He walks out with a wedding ring and a secret powerful enough to bury them both. Celeste Blackwood, the coldest CEO in town, needs a husband before the board meeting, or the entire company will fall into the hands of her evil uncle. This is the story of a deal no one wants, but no one can refuse. Follow the story to the end, and leave a comment with the city you're in, so I know how far this story has come. The elevator doors opened on the 41st floor, and Ethan Hale felt his stomach drop the way it always did right before something bad happened. He'd learned that feeling in hospital corridors, waiting rooms, places where bad news lived. Now it was following him into a glass tower that smelled like money and fear. He straightened his tie, the same gray one he'd worn to 3 job interviews and 1 funeral planning meeting that never happened because they couldn't afford the funeral home's deposit yet. His sister Mia was still breathing, still fighting. He had to keep believing that mattered. The assistant at the desk didn't look up. "Mr. Hale, Ms. Blackwood is expecting you." Expecting him, not summoning, not requesting. Expecting. Like she already knew what he was going to say before he said it, which honestly wouldn't have surprised him. Everyone said Celeste Blackwood saw 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room. He'd spent 4 years in her company's financial division, proving numbers right and wrong, catching discrepancies nobody else noticed. And apparently that meant something to her because 3 days ago, his manager had pulled him into a closet-sized office and told him the CEO wanted to see him personally. Personally. As if that word wasn't going to ruin his week, he pushed open the door. The office took up half the floor, all black marble and glass. The city spread out below like a circuit board. Celeste Blackwood stood at the window with her back to him. Dark hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. A charcoal suit that probably cost more than his rent for the year. She didn't turn around right away. She let the silence stretch, let him stand there sweating through his one good shirt. "Mr. Hale?" Her voice was flat, controlled. The kind of voice that had learned a long time ago never to crack in front of people who were waiting for it to crack. "Do you know why I called you up here?" "No, ma'am." "Stop that." She turned. Her eyes were sharp, gray-green, exhausted in a way she was clearly trying to hide under expensive concealer. "I'm 29. I'm not your mother." "Sorry, Ms. Blackwood." He kept his hands at his sides. "Don't fidget. Don't give her anything to read." "I assumed I was being let go." "Why would you assume that?" "Because nobody gets called up here for a promotion." Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one that had died young. "You're not wrong. Sit." He sat. The chair was too low, designed to make whoever occupied it feel smaller than the desk, smaller than her. He recognized power furniture when he saw it. He'd read about it in a leadership seminar his old boss made everyone attend, back before the layoffs, back before his life turned into a slow-motion car crash he couldn't steer out of. Celeste didn't sit. She stayed standing, arms crossed, studying him the way you'd study a contract you weren't sure you wanted to sign. "I've read your file," she said. "Princeton, top of your class. You turned down 2 offers from firms that would have tripled your salary to stay here. Why?" "Family stuff. I needed the flexibility this place gave me. Different hours." "Your sister?" It wasn't a question. "Mia Hale, 22. Stage 3 lymphoma, currently in treatment at Caldwell Memorial." She said it without flinching, the way she'd read a quarterly report. "I know everything about the people who work for me, Mr. Hale. It's not personal. It's a due diligence." His jaw tightened. "Then you know I can't afford to lose this job." "I know you're 3 months behind on her treatment balance, and your landlord sent you a notice last week." She let that sit there between them, ugly and exposed. "I also know you caught a $4 million discrepancy in the Hartwell acquisition that 3 senior analysts missed. You're good at finding things people try to hide. That's rare. Most people see what they're told to see." "Is there a point to this?" "There's always a point." She finally moved, sitting on the edge of her desk, close enough now that he could see the fine lines of stress around her eyes, the kind no concealer fully covered. I have a proposition. It's going to sound insane. I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say no. I haven't said no yet. You will. Everyone does at first. She exhaled, and for 1 second the ice cracked just enough to show something underneath. Fear, maybe, or exhaustion so deep it had become permanent. My grandfather built this company from a single textile mill. When he died, he left a clause in his will, a morality clause, his lawyers called it. If I am not married before the board's annual certification this December, controlling interest reverts to my next of kin. Your uncle. Victor Blackwood. She said the name like it tasted bad. My grandfather thought he was protecting the company from reckless decisions. What he actually did was hand a loaded gun to the one person in this family who's been trying to kill me, professionally, for a decade. Ethan felt the shape of where this was going before she said it, and his pulse kicked up hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. I need a husband, Mr. Hale, by December. Someone the board will believe, someone the press won't pick apart in a week. 1 year, a real legal marriage on paper, separate lives behind closed doors. At the end of the year, we file for an amicable divorce. You walk away with a settlement large enough to pay off every medical bill your sister will ever generate, and I keep my company out of my uncle's hands. The room went quiet enough that he could hear the air conditioning hum. You're joking. I don't joke. Ask anyone. You want me to marry you, for business. I want you to save my company, and in exchange, I will save your sister's life. Her voice didn't waver once. Don't pretend that's not a fair trade, Mr. Hale. You've been doing math in your head every night trying to figure out how to keep her alive. I'm offering you the answer. He stood up so fast the low chair scraped against the marble. You don't get to talk about my sister like she's a line item. I'm not. For the first time, something genuine broke through, quick and raw, before she buried it again. I watched my mother die slow because we couldn't get her into the trial that might have saved her. My father didn't have the money, and my grandfather wouldn't give it to him out of spite. I know exactly what it costs to watch someone you love run out of time while you stand there useless. I'm not insulting your sister. I'm telling you I understand. That landed somewhere it shouldn't have. He hated that it did. Why me? He asked, quieter now. You could buy any man in this city for that kind of money. Because most men would take the money and try to take more. You caught a $4 million fraud and reported it, instead of cashing in on the silence. You're the only person in this building I trust not to stab me in the back once the cameras are on us. She met his eyes. I need someone who's good under pressure and has no interest in actually wanting what's mine. You don't want this company, Mr. Hale. You want your sister to live. That makes you the safest man I know. He laughed, short and humorless. That's the saddest thing anyone's ever called a compliment. Welcome to my life. He turned to the window, looked out at the gray sprawl of the city, at the hospital somewhere out there holding his sister together with chemicals and stubbornness. A year. 1 year of pretending to love a stranger in exchange for the only thing that might actually save Mia. It sounded insane. It sounded like exactly the kind of deal that ruined people's lives in the stories his mother used to warn him about before she passed. What happens if I say no? Then I find someone else, and you go back downstairs and keep doing spreadsheets until your sister runs out of options. No cruelty in it, just fact, delivered the way she delivered everything, without the comfort of a lie. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the truth. I don't have time to be gentle about it. And if I say yes, then in exactly 11 days, you marry me in a courthouse with 2 witnesses, you move into the east wing of my residence, and starting Monday we begin appearing in public as a couple deeply, disgustingly in love. A dry edge crept into her voice. You'll need to learn to fake affection convincingly. I'm told that's difficult for some people. I'm an analyst. I fake enthusiasm in budget meetings every week. The ghost of a smile came back, longer this time. Then you're already qualified. He should have said no. Every rational part of him screamed it, the part that had read enough financial contracts to know that desperate people sign the deals that destroy them. But he thought of Mia in that hospital bed, asking him last week, voice thin as paper, whether he was eating enough, whether he was sleeping, worrying about him instead of herself, even as the chemo stripped the color out of her. He thought about the unpaid invoices stacking up on his kitchen table like a countdown. I need to see the contract, he said. Every clause, and I want my lawyer to review it, not yours. Done. She didn't even blink. She walked to her desk and pulled a folder from the drawer, already prepared, already waiting for him before he'd even agreed, which told him everything about how confident she'd been that he would. It should have made him angrier than it did. There's a non-disclosure clause regarding the nature of the arrangement. If it leaks before the board certification, the deal is void and you forfeit any compensation. And if your uncle finds out anyway? Her expression hardened into something colder than anything he'd seen yet. Victor has been trying to find a crack in this company since the day my grandfather died. He'll be watching. He'll have people watching. You need to understand something about him before you sign anything, Mr. Hale. He is not a man who loses gracefully. He spent 10 years smiling at galas while quietly trying to bankrupt subsidiaries, plant false stories with reporters, and turn board members against me one whispered lie at a time. If he finds a weakness in this marriage, he will use it like a knife. Sounds like a wonderful family. You have no idea. She slid the folder across the desk toward him. I need an answer by Friday. The board meets in 11 days to finalize the certification calendar, and I need this airtight before then. He picked up the folder. It felt heavier than paper should. One more thing, he said. If I do this, and I haven't said I will, I want it understood that I'm not some prop you wheel out for press photos. If we're doing this, we do it like it's real enough to survive scrutiny. That means honesty between us, even about the ugly parts. I've spent the last 8 months lying to insurance companies and collection agencies to buy my sister time. I don't have room left in my life for lying to the person I'm supposed to be married to. Something in Celeste's face shifted, like she hadn't expected that particular condition, hadn't expected him to ask for something that wasn't money. Agreed, she said, and for once her voice sounded almost human. Honesty. Within reason. Within reason, he repeated, and they both understood that phrase was already doing a lot of work it would eventually have to answer for. He left the office with the folder under his arm and his hands shaking just slightly, the kind of shake that came after a decision too big to fully process standing up. He didn't go back to his desk. He went down to the lobby, out onto the sidewalk, and called the hospital, needing to hear that Mia was still there, still breathing, before he let himself believe any of this was real. She answered on the third ring, voice thready but alert. Hey, you sound weird. I'm fine, he said, even though nothing about the last 20 minutes qualified as fine. How are you feeling? Like garbage, but functional garbage. A small, exhausted laugh. Tell me something good, Ethan. I need something good today. He looked up at the glass tower behind him, 41 floors of secrets and money, and a woman who'd just offered to buy his sister's life with a wedding ring. I might have good news, he said carefully. I'll tell you when I know for sure. He hung up before she could ask more questions. He wasn't ready to answer. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with the contract spread out under a bulb that flickered every few seconds, because he hadn't had the money to replace it. He read every clause twice. Compensation structured in quarterly disbursements tied to public appearances and board milestones. Enough in the first payment alone to clear every overdue invoice from Caldwell Memorial. A final settlement at the year's end that would set Mia up for whatever came after remission, if remission came at all. Strict confidentiality. A clause about physical living arrangements, separate bedrooms, the East Wing entirely his, no expectation of intimacy beyond what was required for appearances. A clause about termination. Either party could end the agreement early only under specific, narrow conditions, otherwise the full year was binding. And buried near the back, almost as an afterthought, a clause that made his chest go tight. In the event of Celeste's death or incapacitation during the contract term, all compensation obligations transferred immediately and in full, regardless of remaining duration. She'd thought about dying. She'd written it into the contract like it was just another line item, the same flat efficiency she used for everything else. He wondered how many nights she'd spent alone in that glass tower, thinking about all the ways her own family might end her, and writing contingency clauses instead of crying about it. He thought about his mother, dead 11 years now, and the last thing she'd told him before the cancer took the rest of her words. Take care of your sister, whatever it costs you. He hadn't understood back then how literal that promise might one day become. He signed it at 2:14 in the morning, alone at his kitchen table, the flickering bulb buzzing overhead like a held breath. The courthouse ceremony 11 days later lasted 6 minutes. Celeste wore ivory, simple and severe, nothing like a woman's idea of a wedding dress, more like armor with a hemline. Ethan wore the same gray suit he'd worn to her office, because it was the only suit he owned that didn't have a hole in the lining. 2 witnesses stood in for family. Neither of them wanted there. A stone-faced attorney from Celeste's legal team and a notary who looked deeply unbothered by the strangeness of the whole affair, like she'd seen weirder marriages walk through that courthouse before. When the officiant asked Ethan to repeat his vows, his voice came out steadier than he expected. When Celeste repeated hers, something in her tone cracked for half a second on the word honor, like the word cost her more than she expected it to. They didn't kiss. The officiant looked between them awkwardly, and Celeste simply said, "We'll save that for the cameras," and the moment dissolved into the practical business of signing documents. Outside, a black car waited to take them to the press conference Celeste's PR team had scheduled within the hour, a strategic surgical announcement designed to control the narrative before anyone else could shape it for them. Ethan sat beside his new wife in the back seat, watching the city blur past the tinted windows, and felt the full weight of what he'd just done settle into his bones. "Nervous?" Celeste asked, not looking at him, fixing her cuff with sharp, precise movements. "Terrified," he admitted. "You?" "I don't do nervous." A pause, and then quieter, almost involuntary. "I do calculated risk. This is the biggest one I've ever taken." Comforting. "I never said it would be comfortable. I said it would work." She finally looked at him, and for one strange moment the icy CEO mask slipped just enough that he saw something almost like gratitude underneath it. "Thank you for signing." "Don't thank me yet," he said, watching the press van pull into view ahead of them, vultures with cameras already circling. "We haven't survived the first 10 minutes of being a married couple." She almost smiled. "Welcome to the family business, Mr. Hale." "It's Mrs. Blackwood Hale now, I believe," he said, testing the strange new shape of his own name, and she actually laughed. Short, surprised, like the sound had escaped before she could stop it. The car slowed. Camera flashes lit up the windshield like lightning. Somewhere across the city, in a corner office with a view almost as good as hers, Victor Blackwood was watching the news alert scroll across his phone. Celeste Blackwood marries mystery analyst in sudden courthouse ceremony. And his jaw tightened around a smile that promised this wasn't over, not even close. Ethan didn't know that yet. He only knew that the door of the car was opening, that 100 camera flashes were about to capture the first lie of their marriage, and that somewhere behind his new wife's perfect composure, something fragile and real was already starting to crack open, whether either of them was ready for it or not. The flashes kept firing even after they reached the penthouse elevator. Ghost white after images burned into Ethan's vision long after the car doors sealed them off from the street. Celeste didn't speak until the elevator hit the 40th floor, and when she did, her voice had lost every trace of the wedding day softness from the car. "You held my hand too tight on the courthouse steps. You told me to look like I meant it. There's a difference between meaning it and bruising my knuckles." She flexed her fingers, examining them like evidence. "We need rules. Real ones, not the contract language, actual operating rules for how we survive being looked at by everyone, all the time, starting now." "Fine. Rule 1. Stop talking to me like I'm an intern who missed a deadline." The elevator doors opened on the residence floor before she could answer, which was probably for the best, because the look she gave him could have stripped paint. The east wing was bigger than every apartment Ethan had ever lived in combined. Glass walls, white furniture that looked like nobody had ever actually sat on it, a bed that could have slept 4 people comfortably and would now hold exactly one, him, alone, in a marriage that existed mostly on paper and in front of cameras. He set his single duffel bag down in the middle of the room and felt, for the first time since signing the contract, the full absurdity of his new life pressing against his chest like a hand. Celeste appeared in the doorway, having changed out of the ivory dress into black slacks and a blouse, hair still pulled back tight enough to ache. She didn't come in. She stood at the threshold like the room itself belonged to a stranger. "There's a gala Thursday," she said. "Pediatric wing fundraiser at Caldwell Memorial. My company sponsors it every year." His head snapped up. "Caldwell Memorial. That's where Mia is." "I know. No apology in it, just fact. I didn't choose the venue to manipulate you, if that's what you're thinking. The gala's been on the calendar for 8 months, but it does mean the board, half the press corps, and my uncle will all be in the same building as your sister's oncology ward, and I need you sharp, not distracted." "She's my sister. I'm always distracted." "Then learn to hide it better. That's the job." Celeste crossed her arms, and for a second something flickered behind her eyes. Not coldness, something closer to apology that she clearly didn't know how to deliver. "I'm not trying to be cruel, Mr. Hale." "You can call me Ethan. We're married." "Ethan." She tested it like an unfamiliar word. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to keep us both standing. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one." She left before he could respond, heels clicking down the hallway, and Ethan sat on the edge of the enormous empty bed and put his head in his hands and laughed, low and humorless, at the sheer impossible shape of the life he'd just signed up for. Thursday came faster than he wanted. The gala ballroom at Caldwell Memorial glittered with the kind of money that made Ethan's stomach turn. Crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures shaped like cranes, a string quartet playing something nobody in the room was actually listening to. Celeste moved through it like she'd been built for rooms like this, a hand on his arm, a smile calibrated to exactly the right warmth, never too much. He kept his own face arranged into something he hoped looked like adoration, and probably looked like indigestion. "Smile less," she murmured through her teeth as they approached a cluster of board members. "You look like you're in pain." "I am in pain. These shoes are new." "Welcome to marriage." Then Victor Blackwood appeared, and the temperature in their corner of the ballroom dropped 10 degrees. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a tuxedo that fit like it had been tailored by someone who hated him just slightly less than everyone else did. His smile arrived first, easy and practiced, the kind of smile politicians used right before they lied to a camera. "Celeste, and the famous Mr. Hale." He extended a hand. Ethan shook it and felt something cold pass through the grip, deliberate, like a warning disguised as a courtesy. Quite the whirlwind romance. Courthouse wedding, no family present, very modern. "We didn't want a circus," Celeste said. "No, I imagine not. Circuses draw scrutiny." Victor's eyes moved over Ethan with the slow, clinical assessment of a man pricing livestock. "Tell me, Mr. Hale, what is it you do exactly before you became my niece's husband?" "Financial analysis, acquisitions division." "Ah, so you crunch numbers for a living, and now you've married the woman who signs your paychecks." Victor's smile widened, sharp at the edges. "Forgive me if I find the timing curious. The board certification deadline, the sudden marriage, almost like someone read the will very, very closely." "Careful, Victor." Celeste's voice went quiet, dangerous. "You're implying something you can't prove." "I'm not implying anything, dear. I'm simply admiring how convenient it all is." He picked a flute of champagne off a passing tray, unhurried, savoring the moment. "Your grandfather would be so proud. Or troubled. Hard to say which, honestly. He was complicated about you, wasn't he? Always wondering if you had it in you to actually run this company, or if you'd just inherited the appetite for power without the stomach for it." Ethan felt Celeste's hand tighten on his arm, nails biting through his sleeve. He stepped half an inch closer to her, a wall of presence she hadn't asked for but didn't pull away from either. "I think that's enough," Ethan said, voice level but carrying an edge he didn't usually let people hear. "You've said hello. You've been condescending. I think we're done here." Victor's eyes cut to him, something dangerous sparking behind the practiced charm. "Defensive. Interesting. Most hired husbands know to stay quiet." The words landed like a slap. Ethan felt his pulse jump into his throat, felt the urge to say something he couldn't take back, and beside him Celeste's breath caught, sharp and silent. "I'm not hired," Ethan said, low. "I'm her husband. There's a difference, and you'd know that if you'd ever actually loved anyone in your life instead of just calculating what they were worth to you." Silence cracked open between them, brittle and dangerous. Victor's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes went flat and cold, calculating in a way that made the hair on Ethan's arms stand up. "Careful, Mr. Hale," Victor said softly. "You're new to this family. You don't yet understand what it costs to make enemies in it." He walked away without waiting for a response, vanishing into the crowd like smoke, and Celeste exhaled a breath she'd clearly been holding since the moment he'd appeared. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, but there was no real anger in it, just exhaustion. "He was baiting you. I wasn't going to stand there and let him." "He's always baiting someone. That's how he survives." She looked toward the hospital wing visible through the ballroom's far windows, the lit corridors where Mia was somewhere right now, fighting a battle neither of them could fight for her. "You need to understand something about him, Ethan. He doesn't lose his temper. He waits. He collects. Tonight he collected the fact that you'll defend me without thinking it through first. He'll find a way to use that. Let him try." She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and for the first time since they'd met, she didn't have a sharp reply ready. The weeks that followed blurred into a routine of performance, galas, board dinners, a photographed grocery run that PR insisted would humanize them, late nights drafting talking points at the kitchen island while careful not to brush hands reaching for the same coffee cup. Ethan visited Mia every chance he got, sometimes straight from press events still in his tie, and she'd tease him about looking like a man trapped in someone else's expensive life, not knowing how close to the truth that actually was. "You're different," Mia said one evening, propped up against hospital pillows, IV line taped to the back of her thin hand, eyes too sharp for someone running a fever. "Tired different. Not just busy tired. Something happened tired. It's a lot of adjusting." "Is she good to you?" "Your wife." She said the word with the same disbelieving amusement she'd had since the news broke. "I still can't believe you're married. You couldn't keep a goldfish alive in college." "She's complicated." "That's not an answer." He sat on the edge of her bed, the way he had 100 times before, and for a second he almost told her everything. The contract, the money, the deal that was keeping her treatment funded. He'd promised himself he wouldn't, that she had enough to carry without the weight of knowing her brother had married a stranger to save her life. But sitting there, watching her watch him with that knowing, exhausted patience only siblings developed for each other, he felt the lie sitting heavy in his chest. "She's not what people say about her," he said finally. "She's harder on herself than she is on anyone else. I think she's been alone a long time and doesn't know how to stop being alone, even when someone's standing right next to her." Mia studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You like her." "I respect her." "Ethan." "It's complicated, Mia. Leave it." She let it go, but the small, knowing smile on her face stayed there long after he left the room, and it bothered him the entire drive home. Because she wasn't wrong, and he hated that she wasn't wrong. Back at the penthouse, he found Celeste in the kitchen at nearly midnight, still in her work clothes, a glass of wine untouched in front of her, staring at her laptop screen with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not coldness, not control, just bone-deep weariness. "You're up late," he said. "Auditors found a discrepancy in the Southern Logistics subsidiary. $500,000 unaccounted for. I've been staring at this spreadsheet for 2 hours, and I can't make the numbers tell me anything they don't want to tell me." She rubbed her eyes, and for a moment she looked younger, smaller, like the armor had slipped while no one was watching. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear about this." "Show me." "What?" "Show me the spreadsheet. I'm an analyst, remember? Numbers are the one thing in this whole mess I actually know how to fix." She hesitated, then turned the laptop toward him, and for the next hour they sat side by side at the kitchen island, shoulders almost touching, while he walked her through transaction logs and shell entries, the kind of work he'd done 1,000 times in a cubicle with nobody watching. Except now the only audience was the woman whose entire empire might hinge on what they found. "There." He pointed at a string of transfers routed through 3 different holding accounts before landing in the Southern subsidiary's ledger. "Someone's laundering through your own logistics division. Small enough not to trip standard audits, but it's been happening monthly for almost a year." Celeste went very still. "A year? That's around when Victor started sitting on the subsidiary's oversight committee." "You think it's him?" "I know it's him. I just couldn't prove it until now." She looked at the screen, then at Ethan, something shifting in her expression that looked dangerously close to relief, or gratitude, or both. Thank you. I mean it. It's just math. It's not just math. Nobody else in this company would have caught this or would have cared enough to look. She closed the laptop slowly, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the city outside the glass. Can I ask you something? And I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one. Okay? Do you regret this? The marriage? All of it. He thought about it longer than he probably should have, watching the tired honesty in her face, the way she braced herself for whatever answer he was about to give, like she expected it to hurt. No, he said finally. I regret that you had to be put in a position where this was the only option that made sense. I regret that your family is the reason you don't know how to trust anyone in a room, but I don't regret signing the contract. Mia's bills are paid. She's getting the treatment she needs. And somehow, I ended up married to someone who actually understands what it's like to watch the people you love almost disappear and not be able to stop it. He met her eyes. That's not nothing. Something in her face cracked open, quick and unguarded, before she caught herself and smoothed it back into something more careful. You're better at this than I expected. At marriage? At honesty. She stood, gathering her laptop, putting distance between them the way she always did right when something real threatened to surface. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Celeste. She paused at the doorway, looking back at him for a beat longer than necessary, like she wanted to say something else and didn't have the words for it yet. And then she was gone, and he sat alone in the kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator and the strange, dangerous warmth spreading through his chest that he refused to name. The investigation into Victor's Southern subsidiary fraud consumed the next month. Celeste brought in outside forensic accountants, careful to keep the inquiry quiet, knowing that if Victor caught wind of it before they had ironclad proof, he'd bury the trail so deep it would take years to dig back out. Ethan worked alongside the forensic team in the evenings, cross-referencing what he already knew about the company's internal systems, and somewhere in those long nights of takeout containers and spreadsheets spread across the dining table, something between him and Celeste shifted from contractual courtesy into something that felt uncomfortably like partnership. She started leaving her office door open when he passed by. She started asking his opinion on board strategy instead of just informing him of decisions. Once, after a brutal 12-hour day, she fell asleep on the couch with a folder open on her lap, and he found himself standing over her for a long moment, watching the careful, controlled lines of her face go soft in sleep, before he pulled a blanket over her shoulders and turned off the lights without waking her. He didn't examine that moment too closely. He told himself it was decency, nothing more. But other nights, alone in his vast empty bedroom in the East Wing, he lay awake thinking about the way she'd looked at him in the kitchen, the rare, unguarded gratitude in her voice, and he hated how much space she was beginning to take up in his head that had nothing to do with the contract at all. It was Mia who forced the next collision, though she didn't mean to. She was deep into a difficult round of treatment, weaker than she'd been in weeks, and during one visit, half delirious from medication, she gripped Ethan's hand and made him promise something that had nothing to do with herself. "The girl," she whispered, eyes glassy, voice thin as thread. "Promise me you'll find her. Promise me, Ethan." "What girl, Mia?" "The little girl from the shelter, Lily. I told you about her, the one whose mother left her at the clinic intake desk and never came back. I used to volunteer there before I got sick, you remember? She's still in the system somewhere, still waiting for someone to want her." Tears slipped down Mia's hollow cheeks, the medication stripping away whatever filter usually kept her composed. "I can't stop thinking about her. If something happens to me, I need to know someone's looking out for her. Promise me you'll find out what happened to her. Promise me you won't let her disappear into the system the way everyone disappears." He held her hand and promised, the way you promise a dying request you don't fully understand yet, not realizing the weight that single promise would eventually carry, not realizing how deep the roots of that abandoned little girl's story actually ran into the family he'd just married into. He started quietly digging the following week. Old shelter records, intake forms, a name half redacted in a file Mia had mentioned once in passing months before she got sick. He used skills sharpened over years of finding what people tried to bury in financial statements, except now he was searching adoption records and county case files instead of shell accounts working late at his own laptop in the East Wing with the door closed, careful not to mention it to Celeste, telling himself it had nothing to do with her family. Not yet. Not until he actually had something concrete. He didn't know yet that the trail he was quietly pulling on would eventually lead directly back to the Blackwood name. He only knew that he'd made a promise to a dying woman, and he intended to keep it, whatever it cost him. The fracture came on a Tuesday, ordinary and unremarkable until it wasn't. Celeste needed a document from Ethan's home office, a notarized power of attorney form related to a hospital decision for Mia that she'd offered to help expedite through her legal team's connections, a kindness she'd extended without making a show of it. She knocked twice, got no answer, assumed he was out, and let herself in to retrieve the folder from his desk where he'd told her it would be. What she found instead, sitting open on top of a stack of papers, was a confidential DNA report. 2 names redacted with black marker, except for a single, undeniable detail still visible in the margin: a birth date. A little girl's birth date. And beneath it, in Ethan's handwriting, notes cross-referencing it against Blackwood family medical records he had no legitimate reason to possess. Celeste stood frozen in the doorway of her own husband's office, staring down at evidence that looked, in every devastating way, like proof that Ethan Hale had a secret child he'd been hiding from her since before they signed a single piece of paper. A child whose existence connected, somehow, impossibly, to her own family's bloodline. Her hands started shaking before her mind caught up to what she was looking at. The kitchen door opened behind her. Ethan's voice, easy, unaware. "Celeste? You home early?" He stopped in the doorway of his own office, saw her standing there with the folder open in her hands, saw the color drain out of her face as she turned to look at him, and understood, with the sick lurch of a man watching a car crash. He couldn't stop in time, that everything between them was about to break apart over a secret he hadn't even had the chance to explain. "Explain this." Celeste's voice came out steadier than her hands, the folder trembling slightly even as her tone stayed razor flat. "Explain this right now, Ethan. It's not what it looks like. It's a DNA report with a child's birth date, cross-referenced against my family's medical history, in your handwriting." She took a step toward him, and he saw something in her face he'd never seen before. Not the controlled ice she wore in boardrooms, but something raw underneath it, something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. "Tell me what it looks like, then. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my husband has a daughter he never mentioned, and somehow that daughter is tangled up in my own bloodline, and he's been digging through confidential records in his own house instead of telling me to my face." "Celeste, I can explain, but you have to give me a second." "I don't have to give you anything." Her voice cracked on the last word just slightly, the first real fracture he'd heard in her composure since the night in the kitchen, weeks ago. "You stood in my office. You signed a contract. You told me honesty, even about the ugly parts. That's what you said. Those exact words. And this entire time, it's not my daughter." The words landed in the room and sat there, heavy and unconvincing, because he could see in her face that she'd already built the worst version of the story, and his denial alone wasn't going to tear it down. "Then whose is it?" She held up the folder, hand still shaking. "Whose birth date is this, Ethan? Why does it matter to my family's medical records? Why have you been hiding this in a folder in your office instead of telling your wife?" "Because I didn't have proof of anything yet, and I didn't want to drag you into something that might be nothing." "Drag me into it? It already has my family's name on it. My sister." His voice cracked now too, raw and desperate, words tumbling out faster than he could organize them. "My sister, before she got too sick to volunteer anymore. She used to work at a children's shelter downtown. There was a little girl there, Lily. Abandoned at intake, no family ever came looking for her. Mia made me promise. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd find out what happened to that girl. Make sure she didn't just disappear into the system. That's it. That's what I've been doing. I've been trying to trace her case file, trying to find out who her biological family is so I can make sure she's protected, because I made a promise to my dying sister, and I didn't know how to tell you without it sounding insane." Celeste's breathing had gone shallow, fast, her eyes searching his face for the lie she expected to find there. And the cross-reference to my family's medical records. Explain that. I don't know yet. I swear to you, I don't know yet. The case file had a partial DNA match flagged against a private registry, and the registry pulled up a fragment that overlapped with medical records filed under the Blackwood Family Trust. I was trying to figure out if it was a coincidence or something real before I brought it to you, because if it's real, Celeste, it means someone in your family abandoned that little girl, and I didn't want to accuse anyone without proof. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ethan had ever heard. Celeste set the folder down on the desk with exaggerated care, like she didn't trust her own hands not to crumple it, and pressed her palms flat against her eyes for a long moment, breathing in short, controlled bursts. "You should have told me," she said finally, quieter now, but no less furious. "The day you started looking into this, the day you found that file. You should have come to me." "I know." "No, you don't know, because if you knew, you would have done it. Instead, I find out by walking into my own husband's office looking for a power of attorney form and finding a folder that makes it look like you've been lying to me since the day we met." Her voice rose again, sharp enough to cut. "Do you understand what that felt like? Standing here, reading that, thinking the one person in this entire arrangement I actually let myself trust had a secret this big and never said a word?" "You're right to be angry." "I'm not just angry, Ethan. I'm furious. And worse than that, I'm humiliated because for about 10 seconds standing in this room, I actually believed it. I actually believed you'd hidden a child from me. And the fact that some small, stupid part of me cared enough to be devastated by that, instead of just calling my lawyer, tells you exactly how much of an idiot I've let myself become in this marriage." The admission hung in the air between them, unintended and unstoppable, and Ethan watched her realize what she'd just said, watched the horror of it cross her face a half second before she could control it. "Celeste, don't." She held up a hand, stepping back from him like the distance might undo the last 10 seconds. "Don't say anything right now. I need to think. I need you to believe me." "I believe you." She said it fast, almost angrily, like the admission cost her something. "That's the problem. I believe every word you just said, and I still feel like the ground just came out from under me, and I don't know how to separate those two things right now." She walked past him out of the office, footsteps sharp against the hardwood, and Ethan stood alone among his scattered files with his pulse hammering and the distinct sick feeling that something he hadn't even finished investigating was about to blow up in both their faces from an entirely different direction. He found out exactly how right he was less than 18 hours later. The board emergency session was called for 9 in the morning, no warning, no agenda circulated in advance, which in Ethan's limited experience with corporate procedure meant someone wanted the element of surprise on their side. He sat beside Celeste in the boardroom's gallery seating, not permitted at the table itself since he held no formal position in the company, watching her spine go rigid the moment Victor Blackwood walked in flanked by 2 attorneys and a folder thick enough to be a small book. "Thank you all for accommodating the short notice," Victor said, taking his seat at the far end of the table with the unhurried confidence of a man who already knew how the next hour was going to end. "I'm afraid I've uncovered something deeply troubling, and given the gravity of it, I felt it couldn't wait." "Get to the point, Victor," Celeste said. "Patience, dear. This concerns you directly, so I'd think you'd want the full context." He opened the folder, sliding copies down the table to each board member with theatrical precision. "It has come to my attention that your husband, Mr. Ethan Hale, has been conducting an unauthorized investigation into confidential family medical and adoption records connected to this company's founding trust, using internal company resources and his access as an employee." Ethan's stomach dropped through the floor. He accessed shelter intake records, private DNA registries, and cross-referenced them against Blackwood family medical files held in strictest confidence by this company's legal trust, Victor continued, voice rising with practiced outrage. "I have email logs showing his search activity routed through company servers. I have time-stamped access records. What we are looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is potential corporate espionage, conducted by the CEO's own husband, using company infrastructure to dig into matters that, frankly, raise very disturbing questions about what exactly Mr. Hale was trying to find, or hide." "That's a lie," Ethan said, half rising from his seat before a hand on his arm. "Celeste, gripping hard, pulled him back down. Is it? Victor turned to him with a cold, satisfied smile. Then perhaps you'd like to explain to this board why you were searching adoption records connected to a Blackwood family member using your work credentials, Mr. Hale. Perhaps you'd like to explain why a forensic accounting team was quietly brought in last month to investigate the Southern Logistics subsidiary, a subsidiary I happen to oversee, around the exact same time you began this little personal investigation. It looks, to me, very much like a coordinated effort between you and my niece to manufacture evidence against me using whatever you could dig up, financial or otherwise. The room had gone utterly silent, every board member's eyes swinging between Ethan and Celeste like spectators at a car wreck. That's not what happened, Celeste said, voice tight with fury but controlled, every word measured. The forensic investigation into the Southern subsidiary was initiated because of a documented discrepancy in the books, something my team can substantiate with hard evidence whenever this board would like to see it. As for my husband's personal investigation, that has nothing to do with company resources or company business. He used company servers, Celeste, to search public shelter records on his lunch break, which is not a crime and certainly not corporate espionage, regardless of how badly you'd like to spin it into one. And the DNA match to our family's medical trust? You'll forgive me if that doesn't strike me as an innocent coincidence. Victor's voice dropped, low and venomous. It strikes me as a man who married into this family, for money discovering something he thought he could leverage, and a CEO desperate enough to keep her seat that she's willing to look the other way while her husband digs through private family trauma like it's a financial statement. Careful, Ethan said, low and dangerous, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Choose your next words very carefully. Or what, Mr. Hale? You'll defend your wife's honor again the way you did at the gala? Victor smiled thinly. I find it fascinating how quickly you've become so invested in protecting a marriage that, by all appearances, started as nothing more than a transaction designed to save this company from falling into competent hands. Oh, a board member near the middle of the table, an older woman named Patricia Voss, who'd served on the board since before Celeste was born, cleared her throat. Victor, with respect, accusations of espionage require evidence, not implication. Do you have anything beyond server logs showing he searched public records? I have enough to warrant a formal investigation and a temporary suspension of Mr. Hale's wife's authority to make unilateral decisions regarding company personnel and resources pending that investigation, Victor said smoothly, like he'd rehearsed exactly this question. I'm formally requesting the board vote to freeze Celeste Blackwood's executive authority for 30 days while an independent committee reviews these findings. And I'm requesting Mr. Hale be barred from company premises and any contact with company systems during that period. The room erupted into overlapping voices, board members talking over each other, papers shuffling, someone demanding clarification on procedure. Celeste sat utterly still beside Ethan, her hand still gripping his arm, knuckles white, her face a mask of controlled fury that he knew, after weeks of living beside her, was barely containing something close to panic underneath. This is exactly what he wants, she said under her breath, only for Ethan to hear. Chaos, doubt. He doesn't need proof, he just needs the board uncertain enough to vote against me on a technicality. 30 days of frozen authority, right before the certification deadline, could be enough for him to maneuver allies into position. Then we fight it. With what? You found a folder with a partial DNA match and a hunch, Ethan. We don't have proof of anything yet. We don't even know who that little girl's biological parent actually is. Her voice trembled, just barely, the first time he'd ever heard real fear in it instead of fury. If this vote goes through, even temporarily, it sends a signal to every ally I have on this board that I'm vulnerable. Vultures don't wait for confirmation. They circle the second they smell blood. The board chairman called for order, voice cutting through the noise. We will proceed to a procedural vote on Mr. Blackwood's motion to temporarily suspend Miss Blackwood's unilateral executive authority pending investigation. All those in favor— Wait. Ethan stood, ignoring Celeste's hand trying to pull him back down, ignoring every instinct telling him this wasn't his fight to have a voice in. Before you vote, I want the record to show something. Victor Blackwood claims I was digging through confidential family records to manufacture leverage. He's right that I found something. He's wrong about what it means, and I think, If you're being honest with yourselves, every person at this table already suspects he's wrong, because the alternative, that I stumbled onto something Victor desperately doesn't want found, explains a lot more about why he's standing here right now, rushing this vote through before anyone has time to actually investigate properly. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Hale, the chairman said carefully. Do you have evidence to support it? Ethan looked at Victor, who was watching him with the calm, predatory stillness of a man who believed he'd already won, who believed the next 30 days would be enough time to bury whatever needed burying before anyone could connect the threads. Not yet, Ethan admitted, but I will. Then I'd suggest you find it quickly, the chairman said, not unkindly, because procedurally, I don't see grounds to deny Mr. Blackwood's motion based on an accusation with no supporting evidence. He looked around the table. All those in favor of the 30-day suspension of executive authority pending investigation. Hands began rising around the table, slow and reluctant in some cases, immediate in others, and Ethan watched Celeste's face as she counted them in real time, watched the exact moment she understood the vote was going to pass. It passed 8-5. The chairman's gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have, and Celeste Blackwood, CEO and sole controlling heir to a company her grandfather built from nothing, sat frozen in her chair while her authority was stripped away in front of her, effective immediately, for 30 days that would end mere weeks before the certification deadline that would determine the rest of her life. Victor stood, buttoning his jacket with unhurried satisfaction, gathering his folder. I want to be clear that this isn't personal, Celeste. This is simply due diligence. I'm sure once the investigation clears your husband of wrongdoing, your authority will be promptly reinstated. His smile said the opposite of every word coming out of his mouth. Assuming, of course, the investigation does clear him. He walked out of the boardroom without waiting for a response, his attorneys trailing behind him, and the remaining board members filed out in awkward silence, none of them quite meeting Celeste's eyes, until it was just the two of them left in the enormous room, the gavel's echo finally fading into nothing. Celeste didn't move for a long moment. Then she pressed both hands flat against the polished table and exhaled, slow and shaking, the full weight of what had just happened finally cracking through the composure she'd held together since Victor first walked in. 30 days, she said, voice hollow. 30 days with no authority, right before certification, with my own uncle controlling the narrative the entire time. He's going to use every single day of this to turn the board against me permanently. We're going to fix this. How, Ethan? She turned on him, the fury finally breaking loose. Not at him exactly, but needing somewhere to go. How exactly are we going to fix this? You found a folder with a partial match and no proof. I have no authority to access company resources to investigate further. Victor has 30 days, a legal team, and a head start. Tell me how we fix this, because right now I genuinely don't see it. We find Lily's biological family. We prove the connection. We find out exactly what Victor's been hiding, and we use it before he can finish what he started today. And if there's nothing to find, if that birth date match really is just a coincidence and we spend 30 days chasing a ghost while Victor consolidates power, then we lose the company, Ethan said quietly, meeting her eyes without flinching. But I don't think it's a coincidence. I think Victor just showed us exactly how scared he is of what we might find by trying this hard to bury it before we found it. Celeste stared at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her exhausted eyes. Not quite hope, but something close enough to it that it hurt to look at directly. If we're doing this, she said finally, we do it together. No more separate investigations, no more folders you don't show me. If you find something, I see it the moment you find it, and if I find something, you see it. We can't survive Victor divided. We barely survived him today, and he wasn't even trying that hard yet. Together, Ethan agreed. She nodded once, sharp and decisive, the CEO mask sliding back into place even though he'd seen what was underneath it now, even though something between them had shifted in that boardroom in a way neither of them had time to examine. She picked up her phone, already dialing her attorney, already moving into the next fight before the last one had finished bruising her, and Ethan followed her out of the boardroom into a 30-day countdown that would either save everything they'd built or destroy it completely, with no room left for either of them to be anything less than exactly what the moment demanded. 26 days into the suspension, Ethan found the woman who'd processed Lily's intake 6 years earlier, living 2 states away under a different last name, working a night shift at a diner off a state highway that smelled like burnt coffee and motor oil. Her name was Renata Cole. She'd been 23 when she worked the shelter desk, and the moment Ethan slid the redacted intake photo across the counter, her hand started shaking so hard she nearly knocked over her coffee pot. "I'm not supposed to talk about that file," she said, voice barely above a whisper, eyes darting toward the kitchen pass-through like someone might be listening. "I signed something. They paid me to sign something." "Who paid you?" "A lawyer. Older guy. Silver hair, real expensive suit for a guy meeting me in a parking lot at midnight." Her jaw tightened. $5,000 to forget a name and burn my copies of the intake paperwork. I needed the money. I had my own kid to feed. I'm not proud of it, but I did it. Ethan's pulse kicked up so hard he could feel it in his teeth. "I need that name, Renata. I need to know who dropped that little girl off. If I tell you, and it gets back to him, I'm finished. He made that very clear. He's about to lose everything, I promise you. Whatever threat he made, it's not going to matter once this is over." Ethan leaned forward, voice low and urgent. "There's a little girl who spent 6 years in the system because somebody paid people like you to make sure nobody ever came looking for her. You have a chance to fix that right now." Renata's eyes filled, and for a long, agonizing moment, Ethan thought she'd shut down completely. Then she reached under the counter, pulled out a battered shoebox from beneath a stack of order pads, and set it down with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "I kept one copy," she whispered. "I don't know why. Guilt, I guess. I knew someday somebody'd come asking, and I didn't want to be the only one who knew and said nothing." Inside the shoebox, beneath a layer of grease-stained napkins, was a single folded intake form, the ink faded but legible. A man's signature at the bottom, scrawled fast, like he'd wanted to be done with it as quickly as possible. Victor Blackwood. And beside it, in smaller handwriting, the mother's name. A name Ethan recognized instantly from years-old society pages buried deep in archived gossip columns. A woman who'd vanished from public life under mysterious circumstances the same year the little girl had been abandoned at the shelter. He photographed every page with shaking hands, thanked Renata more times than the moment probably warranted, and drove through the night back to the city with the proof sitting on the passenger seat like a live wire. Celeste was waiting at the penthouse when he burst through the door at 4 a.m, still in yesterday's clothes, eyes raw from exhaustion and 26 days of fighting a war from outside her own office. She'd barely slept since the suspension. He could see it in the hollows under her eyes, the new sharpness in her cheekbones, the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the folder he held out. She read the intake form twice, then a third time, her breath going shallow and fast. "It's him," she said, voice cracking. "It's actually him. He signed it himself. 6 years he's been letting his own daughter rot in the system while he played the grieving, wronged uncle in board meetings." "There's more." Ethan pulled out his phone, showing her the photographs he'd taken of the medical records he'd cross-referenced weeks ago. "The DNA match isn't a coincidence. Lily is Victor's biological daughter. Her mother was involved with him during a period your grandfather never knew about, an affair he kept buried because it would have destroyed his political standing at the time. When the affair ended badly, Victor paid the mother to disappear, and when she couldn't care for the child alone, he made sure the paper trail evaporated rather than risk anyone connecting his name to an abandoned daughter." Celeste sat down hard on the edge of the couch, the folder shaking in her hands. 6 years. She's been alone for 6 years because he couldn't stand the idea of a scandal. "There's something else." Ethan hesitated, watching her face brace for more bad news. "The Southern subsidiary fraud, the $500,000 in laundered funds. I think it connects. I pulled the dates against Renata's payment, against the lawyer's retainer records I found buried 3 shell companies deep. He's been funneling money out of the subsidiary partly to pay off everyone who knew about Lily, partly to build a war chest he can use to buy votes once the certification fight really heats up. He's been bleeding my company to bury his own daughter and fund a coup." Celeste's voice had gone flat, dangerous, the particular calm of someone standing at the edge of something irreversible. 26 days, Ethan. He's had 26 days of unchecked authority while we chase this down, and the board vote on full reinstatement is in 4 days. If we don't have this airtight by then, we will. But we need to move now, tonight, because the second he realizes that intake form exists, he'll burn every connection to Renata, to the mother, to all of it. We have a window, and it's closing fast. Celeste stood, already moving, already shifting from devastated to lethal in the span of a single breath, the transformation Ethan had come to recognize as the exact moment she stopped being a wounded woman and became something closer to a weapon. Call the forensic team. I want the Southern Subsidiary trail finalized by morning. I'm calling Patricia Voss. She's the only board member I trust completely, and she'll know how to get us an emergency session before the reinstatement vote instead of after. It's 4 in the morning. Patricia's 73. She doesn't sleep either. Celeste was already dialing, phone pressed to her ear, voice steady despite the storm visibly raging behind her eyes. Patricia, it's Celeste. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to trust me one more time before this is over. The next 3 days passed in a blur of motion that Ethan would later struggle to fully remember in sequence. Forensic accountants working in shifts in a rented conference room across town, away from company offices, Victor's allies might still be monitoring. A private investigator tracking down Lily's birth mother, now living quietly under a different name, finally willing to speak after years of silence, once she learned her daughter might finally have a chance at protection. Celeste sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, surviving on coffee and sheer will, the dark circles under her eyes deepening with every passing hour. On the second night, exhausted past the point of caution, they sat across from each other at the conference table, surrounded by printouts and financial timelines, and something between them finally cracked open that neither of them had the energy left to keep contained. I keep thinking about her, Celeste said, staring at a photograph the investigator had managed to obtain. Lily, 7 years old now, sitting alone on a bench outside a group home, knees pulled to her chest. 6 years old when I should have known she existed. My own cousin, and I never knew, because he made sure nobody ever would. You're going to fix that. Am I? Celeste's voice cracked, raw with exhaustion. I might lose the certification vote anyway, Ethan. Even with everything we've found, if Victor's bought enough allies on that board, none of this matters. He'll spin it, delay it, bury it in litigation for years while that little girl ages out of the system with nobody. Then we don't let him spin it. We hit him with everything at once, in front of the full board, with no warning, the same way he hit you 26 days ago. No gradual reveal, no piece-by-piece defense. We bury him under the weight of it before he has time to react. Celeste looked at him across the table, something fierce and frightened and determined, all fighting for space behind her eyes. If this goes wrong, it goes wrong completely. There's no middle ground left. We expose everything, or we lose everything. I know. I need you to understand what I'm about to ask of you. She reached across the table, gripping his hand with a desperation that had nothing to do with performance, nothing to do with cameras or board members watching. If this fails, the settlement clause in our contract becomes irrelevant. There won't be a company left to pay it from. Mia's bills. I don't care about the money anymore, Celeste. The words came out before he could stop them, raw and unguarded. I haven't cared about the money in weeks. I care about you not losing everything your grandfather built to a man who abandoned his own daughter and called it discretion. I care about that little girl finally having someone fight for her. I care about... He stopped himself, breath catching, the unfinished sentence hanging dangerously in the air between them. Celeste's grip on his hand tightened. Neither of them moved to pull away. Say it, she whispered. Celeste? Say it, Ethan. We might lose everything in 4 days. I need to know I'm not the only one standing here feeling something that has nothing to do with a contract. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard it hurt. I care about you. Not the arrangement. Not the deal. You. I have for weeks, and I've been too much of a coward to say it because saying it makes it real, and real things can be taken away. She closed the distance between them before he finished the thought, and for one suspended moment in a rented conference room littered with evidence of betrayal and fraud, the war outside that room ceased to exist entirely. Then her phone rang, shattering the moment, and the voice on the other end was Patricia Voss, breathless and urgent. "Victor knows," Patricia said. "Someone tipped him off about your forensic team. He's filed an emergency injunction to freeze all evidence gathering, and he's moved up his own motion. He's calling for a permanent transfer of controlling interest at tomorrow's session, not just an extension of the suspension. He's not waiting for the certification deadline anymore, Celeste. He's making his move tomorrow morning." Celeste went rigid, the phone pressed hard against her ear, her eyes locking onto Ethan's with a look that contained every ounce of fear and ferocity she'd been holding back for weeks. "Tomorrow morning, that's..." She checked the time. 6 hours. "Patricia, can you stall the session?" "I can buy maybe an hour with procedural objections. No more than that. Celeste, if you don't walk into that room tomorrow with everything finished and bulletproof, he wins. Permanently. There's no second vote coming after this one." The line went dead. Celeste lowered the phone slowly, her hand shaking, and looked at the chaos of papers spread across the table. Months of investigation, weeks of stolen sleep, a fraud trail that still had gaps, a forensic report not yet finalized, a birth mother's testimony not yet notarized. 6 hours, she said, voice barely controlled. "We have 6 hours to finish what should have taken weeks." Ethan was already moving, gathering files, dialing the lead forensic accountant, adrenaline burning through the exhaustion in his veins like fuel hitting a dying fire. "Then we don't sleep. We finish it tonight." The forensic team arrived within 20 minutes, bleary-eyed and grim, and the conference room transformed into a war room, papers spread across every surface, 3 laptops running simultaneous cross-references. The birth mother on a video call from her apartment 2 states away, voice shaking as she gave sworn testimony into a recorder at 2 a.m. Celeste moved between every conversation with a ferocity that made Ethan's chest ache to watch. No longer the cold, controlled CEO from their first meeting, but something fiercer, something forged in the specific fire of fighting for a family member's life and her own survival in the same desperate breath. By 4 a.m, the fraud trail was complete, every shell company traced, every payment to Renata Cole and the silenced witnesses documented and notarized. By 5, the birth mother's testimony was signed and sealed, a sworn account of Victor's affair, his payoff, his abandonment of their daughter dressed up as discretion. By 5:30, Ethan sat staring at a single remaining gap in the financial trail. One transaction, the largest of them all, routed through an account they couldn't fully trace before the session began. "We don't have time," the lead forensic accountant said, rubbing his eyes, voice rough with exhaustion. "Whatever's behind that final transfer, we walk into that boardroom without it, or we don't walk in at all." Celeste stood at the head of the table, hair falling loose from its tie for the first time Ethan had ever seen, blouse wrinkled, eyes burning with a kind of exhausted, ferocious clarity that made her look less like the polished CEO from the gala and more like a woman standing at the very edge of everything she had left to lose. "We walk in," she said, "gap or no gap. We walk in with what we have, and if Victor pulls that last transaction apart in front of the board, we adapt in real time." "That's reckless," the accountant said. "Everything about the last 6 hours has been reckless." She looked at Ethan, and something passed between them, silent and absolute, the kind of understanding that didn't need words anymore. "We've come too far to play it safe now." The first gray light of dawn was breaking over the city skyline when they finally gathered the last of the documents. Exhaustion sitting in every muscle of Ethan's body like wet concrete, his hands raw from hours of paper and keyboard, his eyes burning, his shirt soaked through with the sweat of a night that had asked everything of him and was about to ask for more. Celeste stood beside him at the conference room window, watching the sun rise over the city that held her family's entire legacy in the balance, and reached over to take his hand one more time before the war began in earnest. "Whatever happens in that room in 2 hours," she said quietly, "I need you to know that none of this, not 1 second of it, felt like a transaction to me anymore." "I know." He squeezed her hand, feeling the tremor in it, the bone-deep exhaustion barely masking something fierce and unbroken underneath. "Let's go end this." They left the conference room together as the sun fully crested the skyline, walking toward a boardroom where Victor Blackwood was already waiting, confident and rested and utterly unprepared for the storm about to walk through his door, unaware that the gap in the financial trail he believed protected him was about to be the very thing that... The boardroom doors opened at exactly 8 o'clock, and Victor Blackwood looked up from his coffee with the easy, rested smile of a man who believed the war was already won. That smile lasted exactly as long as it took him to see Celeste's face. She walked in first, blouse pressed fresh despite the night she'd had, hair pulled back into its tight, controlled knot, every line of exhaustion buried under a layer of will so absolute it read as power instead of fatigue. Ethan walked beside her, a leather folder under his arm thick enough to make several board members exchange uneasy glances. Patricia Voss sat at the table already, eyes sharp despite her 73 years, watching the doors with the alertness of someone who'd spent the last hour running procedural interference and intended to watch the payoff in person. "Celeste." Victor set down his coffee, voice smooth as ever. "I'm glad you could make it, though I should warn you, today's motion is fairly straightforward. I don't expect this to take long." "Neither do I." She took her seat at the head of the table, the seat that was technically still hers despite 30 days of stripped authority, and the small, deliberate act of sitting there instead of in the gallery seating sent a ripple of tension through every board member in the room. "Before we begin your motion, Victor, I'd like to exercise my right as a board member to raise an item of urgent business. Given the gravity of what I'm about to present, I think you'll understand why it takes precedence." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This isn't the time for theatrics, Celeste." "It isn't theatrics. It's 6 years of theft, fraud, and a buried family secret you've been paying people to keep quiet." She nodded to Ethan, and he opened the folder, sliding copies down the table the exact way Victor had done 30 days earlier, the symmetry of it landing like a blow. "I'd like the board's full attention." The room went very still. Ethan stood, hands steadier than he expected given the 26 hours without sleep sitting heavy behind his eyes, and laid out the evidence piece by piece, his voice carrying the flat, precise clarity of a man who had spent years catching discrepancies nobody else noticed and had finally found the discrepancy that mattered most. He walked them through the Southern subsidiary fraud first, the shell companies, the laundered transfers, the forensic accounting that traced 11 months of theft directly back to accounts under Victor's exclusive oversight. He watched several board members' faces shift from skepticism to alarm as the numbers stacked up, irrefutable, documented, notarized. "This is fabricated," Victor said, voice rising for the first time, the smooth charm cracking at the edges. "Manufactured evidence, manufactured by a man with every motive in the world to discredit me, married to the woman who benefits most from my removal." "The forensic firm is independent, Victor," Patricia Voss said coldly. "I retained them myself this morning, specifically because I anticipated you'd make that exact accusation. Their findings stand on their own." Victor's eyes flicked to her, something dangerous moving behind them, and Ethan watched the first real crack appear in the man's composure. "There's more," Ethan said, and pulled out the second set of documents. Renata Cole's intake form, the redacted shelter records now fully unredacted, the sworn testimony from a birth mother who'd spent 6 years hiding from the man who'd paid her to disappear. 6 years ago, a little girl was abandoned at a children's shelter under circumstances that were quietly buried. $5,000 paid to the intake worker to destroy her paperwork. A retainer paid to a lawyer to ensure no public record connected the child to her biological father. He set the final document down directly in front of Victor. Her biological father is sitting at this table right now. The silence that followed was absolute. The kind of silence that had weight, that pressed down on every person in the room. Victor stared at the intake form, at his own signature scrawled across the bottom in ink. 6 years faded, and for the first time since Ethan had met him, the man had nothing smooth in practice to say. "That's not..." Victor's voice came out thin, stripped of its usual control. "That document is decades out of context. You don't understand the circumstances." "Then explain them," Celeste said, voice quiet, dangerous, the fury she'd been holding in check finally beginning to surface. "Explain to this board why you let your own daughter grow up in the system while you sat across from me at family dinners lecturing me about legacy and responsibility. Explain why you funneled $500,000 out of company resources to bury a 6-year-old secret instead of simply claiming her, instead of giving her a family. Explain it to all of us, Victor, because I would genuinely like to understand what kind of man does that to his own blood. Victor's hands had begun to shake, the first physical sign of the composure finally breaking, and something in his face shifted from cornered anger into something closer to exposed shame, quickly buried again beneath a final desperate attempt at control. Whatever I did, it has no bearing on this company's leadership. I demand this be struck from today's session as irrelevant character assassination. It's not irrelevant, Patricia Voss said, standing now, her voice carrying the authority of decades on this board. When the funds used to bury that secret were stolen directly from this company's accounts. That makes it very much our business, Victor, and I'd remind you that embezzlement of this scale isn't a board matter anymore. It's a criminal one. The room erupted. Board members talking over each other, demanding clarification, some reaching for their copies of the forensic report, with hands that weren't entirely steady, the careful order of the meeting collapsing into chaos that Victor had no way left to control. Ethan watched him scan the table, watched him search every face for an ally and find none, watched the precise moment the man understood that 30 days of maneuvering, a decade of careful manipulation, had all collapsed in the span of 20 minutes. "There's one more thing," Celeste said, her voice cutting through the noise, silencing the room with the particular authority of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to win. "Lily is 7 years old. She has spent her entire life in the system because the man sitting at this table couldn't stomach a scandal. I am formally requesting, as part of this board's response to today's revelations, that this company establish a guardianship trust in her name, fully funded, fully protected, completely independent of whatever legal consequences her father faces. Whatever else happens today, that little girl does not spend one more day waiting for someone to claim her." A murmur of agreement moved through the table, and Ethan felt something tight in his chest finally loosen, watching Celeste stand there, exhausted and unbroken, fighting for a child she'd known about for less than a month, with the same ferocity she'd fought for her company her entire life. Victor stood abruptly, chair scraping hard against the floor, his face pale and furious, and finally stripped of every layer of practiced charm. "This is a coordinated attack. I built half of what this company is. You deserve nothing from this table," Patricia said, voice like steel. "Accept the consequences of what you've done. I move that this board formally withdraw all support for Victor Blackwood's motion regarding executive authority, reinstate Celeste Blackwood's full authority immediately, and refer the embezzlement findings to outside legal counsel for criminal review." "Seconded," another board member said, and then another, voices rising one after another around the table until the motion passed with a unanimity that left no room for argument. 10 votes to nothing, 3 abstentions that didn't matter against the overwhelming tide. Victor stood at the end of the table, alone, his attorneys exchanging uneasy glances, his face the color of old ash. He looked at Celeste, and for one brief moment something almost human passed behind his eyes. Not quite remorse, but something close enough to it that Ethan almost felt sorry for him, before he remembered the photograph of a 7-year-old girl sitting alone on a bench outside a group home, and the sympathy evaporated entirely. "You have no idea what it cost me," Victor said quietly, to Celeste alone, like the rest of the room had ceased to exist. "What it cost me to bury that secret, to watch you take everything your grandfather built, while you abandoned a child instead of facing a hard conversation," Celeste finished, voice flat, exhausted, final. "Don't you dare make this about what it cost you, Victor. You had a daughter. You had a choice every single day for 6 years to go find her, to claim her, to be better than the family that raised both of us, to value reputation over people. You chose the company instead. You chose yourself. That's not a tragedy, Victor. That's just who you are." He had nothing left to say to that. He gathered his folder with hands that wouldn't fully stop shaking and walked out of the boardroom flanked by attorneys who already looked like they were calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from him, and the door closed behind him with a soft, anticlimactic click that somehow carried more weight than any dramatic exit could have. Celeste sank back into her chair the moment the door shut, the last of her adrenaline draining out of her all at once, her hands finally beginning to shake now that there was no one left to perform composure for. Ethan moved to her side without thinking, kneeling beside her chair, and she gripped his hand hard enough to hurt, breathing in short, ragged pulls like she'd just surfaced from being underwater for 30 days straight. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's actually over." "It doesn't feel over." Her voice cracked, finally, fully, the tears she'd refused to let herself shed in front of the board, sliding free now that the room had mostly emptied. "It feels like I just watched my entire family fall apart in front of strangers." "Your family fell apart a long time ago, Celeste. Today you just stopped letting him pretend otherwise." She let out a breath that was half sob, half exhausted laugh, and leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and Ethan held her there in the empty boardroom while the morning light came fully up over the city outside, the war finally, truly finished. Victor Blackwood was formally charged 11 days later, embezzlement and fraud at the top of a list that grew longer the deeper investigators dug. His assets frozen, his name stripped from every committee and title he'd spent a decade accumulating. He did not contest the guardianship trust for Lily. Whether out of genuine shame or simple legal calculation, Ethan never fully knew, and eventually stopped caring enough to wonder. Lily moved into temporary care arranged through the trust within the month, a small apartment near Caldwell Memorial, close enough that Ethan visited twice a week, slowly, carefully building the kind of trust that took a frightened 7-year-old time to extend to anyone. She was sharp and watchful, quick to flinch, slow to smile, and the first time she actually laughed at something he said, a clumsy joke about his own inability to braid hair, attempted badly for her benefit. He found himself blinking back tears in a way that embarrassed him until he saw Celeste, standing in the doorway, wiping her own eyes with the back of her hand. "She likes you," Celeste said later that night, the two of them sitting on the penthouse balcony with the city spread out below, quiet in a way it hadn't been in months. "She likes you more. You're the one who fought for her." "We fought for her." Celeste turned to look at him, the exhaustion of the last weeks finally beginning to soften into something gentler around her eyes. "I keep thinking about what you said in that conference room the night before everything broke open, that none of this felt like a transaction anymore." "It didn't. It doesn't to me either." She reached for his hand, the gesture easy now, unguarded, nothing like the careful performance of their first weeks together. "Mia's remission numbers came back this morning. Did she tell you?" Ethan's breath caught. "What?" "Her oncologist called the residence line by mistake looking for you. I took a message." Celeste's smile was small, tired, genuinely happy in a way he'd rarely seen from her. "She's in remission, Ethan. Full remission." He didn't remember standing up. He didn't remember the drive to the hospital, or the elevator ride up to Mia's floor, or anything except the moment he walked into her room and saw her sitting up in bed, color back in her face for the first time in over a year, grinning at him like she already knew exactly what he'd come to hear. "Don't cry," she said, voice thick with her own tears despite the order. "You'll make me start, and I just got my eyebrows to grow back." He crossed the room and held his sister for a long time, feeling the solid, real weight of her, alive and healing and finally out of danger. And somewhere behind him in the doorway, Celeste watched with her arms crossed and her eyes wet, giving the siblings their moment before stepping quietly into the room to be folded into it too. The year mark on their contract arrived on a gray Tuesday morning that felt entirely too ordinary for the weight it carried. Ethan found the paperwork sitting on the kitchen island when he came downstairs, the amicable divorce filing Celeste's legal team had drafted months ago as a formality, sitting there now with a pen resting on top of it, waiting for 2 signatures that would end the arrangement exactly the way the contract had always promised it would. Celeste stood by the window in the morning light, coffee untouched in her hand, watching him find it. "It's ready whenever you want to sign," she said, voice carefully even, the old controlled mask flickering back into place for the first time in months. "I had them finalize it last week. Clean settlement, exactly what we agreed. You're free to walk away whenever you're ready." He looked at the papers, then at her, standing there with her shoulders squared like she was bracing for an impact she'd already decided to absorb without flinching. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "For me to sign it?" "It's what the contract says." "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a long moment, her composure cracking slowly, the careful CEO armor she'd built over a lifetime of protecting herself finally giving way to something rawer underneath. "No," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what I want. I don't want a contractual husband anymore, Ethan. I haven't wanted that in months. I want—" She stopped, breath unsteady, vulnerability sitting strange and unfamiliar on a woman who'd spent her entire adult life never letting anyone see her want anything she wasn't certain she could control. "I want you to stay, not because of a clause, not because of certification or board approval or anything written on paper. I want you to stay because somewhere in the last year you stopped being the man I married to save my company and became the only person I actually trust with everything I am, flaws included, and I don't know how to walk into a future that doesn't have you in it anymore." Ethan crossed the kitchen slowly, picked up the divorce filing from the island, and without a word tore it cleanly in half, then in half again, setting the pieces down on the counter between them. "I'm not signing anything that ends this," he said. "I haven't wanted to for months either. I was just waiting for you to be ready to say it out loud." Celeste let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, the sound of a year's worth of armor finally, fully coming down, and crossed the last few feet of distance between them. He caught her, the coffee cup forgotten somewhere on the counter, and kissed her the way he'd never been allowed to in front of cameras, slow and real and entirely unwatched. The city waking up outside the window without either of them paying it any attention at all. 6 months later, the penthouse held a different kind of noise than it ever had during the contract year. Lily's laughter echoing down the hallway during her weekend visits. Mia's voice on the phone every other evening, stronger now, full of plans for the future she'd nearly lost the right to make. The company had stabilized fully under Celeste's restored leadership, Victor's name reduced to a cautionary footnote in board meeting minutes, the Southern subsidiary cleaned up and running honest under new oversight. Ethan stood on the same balcony where Celeste had once stared down at the city with the weight of an impossible decision pressing on her shoulders, and watched her now, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor inside, patiently helping Lily with a school project, hair loose around her face, laughing at something the little girl said with an ease that the cold, controlled CEO from that first courthouse meeting could never have managed. He thought about the contract sitting torn in a drawer somewhere, a piece of paper that had started as a transaction and ended up rewriting both their lives into something neither of them had been brave enough to want out loud. He thought about his mother's last words to him, the promise to take care of his sister, whatever it cost, and how that promise had led him, impossibly, improbably, into a family he'd never expected and couldn't imagine living without now. Celeste looked up and caught him watching, and the smile she gave him across the room held none of the careful calculation from their first meeting, none of the performance from 100 press events and galas. Just something quiet, certain, and entirely real. He walked back inside, sat down on the floor beside the two of them, and let the life he'd never planned for settle around him like it had always been waiting for him to arrive. We presented as two people who found a practical solution to two separate problems and have conducted themselves professionally throughout. She sat across from him with her hands around the coffee cup. And if the board's response is that any CEO who entered a financial arrangement with an employee is unfit, then we show them what Victor has been doing for 11 years, he said. Because the governance inquiry runs concurrent with the certification, which means if we can introduce evidence of Victor's conduct into the inquiry process, the board has to weigh both. They can't evaluate your judgment in isolation from his. The Crestline connection. Mara, he said, Victor's daughter, whose identity he paid to erase, whose placement records he had altered to remove his name, whose existence is documented in a state file with an irregular chain of custody that any competent attorney can now link to a holding company with his name on a 9-year-old incorporation document. He paused. That's not a governance issue. That's a crime. She held his gaze. If we bring Mara into this, she's already in it. Victor put her in it when he had her records altered. We're just following the thread he left. He leaned forward. Celeste, I made a promise. Not to you, to my sister, who is lying in a hospital bed because she found that file and asked me to find out what happened to that little girl. I told her I would. I'm going to. Something moved through her face, Something that was not the control, not the strategy, not the careful architecture. Something that was just a person, feeling the weight of a promise made by someone else and understanding why it couldn't be put down. "All right," she said. "We move together." He nodded. He picked up the coffee. It was the right temperature, which meant she'd timed it, which meant she was still, always, paying attention to the things that mattered. They were still working at midnight when his phone buzzed. The personal phone, not the clean machine. A number he didn't recognize. He picked it up. "Mr. Hale." A woman's voice. Young. He didn't recognize it. "My name isn't something I want to say on a phone, but I work in the Blackwood Capital IT department, and I've been watching what Ben Sato reported and what happened to that report after it went to Kyle Marsh." Ethan was very still. He looked at Celeste across the table and put the call on speaker without comment. "I have the server logs," the voice said. "Full access records, not the sanitized version that went into the amended complaint. The raw logs with timestamps and user IDs showing every access event on the secure document server for the past 14 months. A pause. "Including the events that Kyle masked before he sent Ben's report upstairs." "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan said. "Because I've worked here for 2 years and I'm not going to watch someone who built something real get destroyed by someone who built something dirty." Another pause. "I'm also looking at Ben's face every day knowing he reported something honestly and watched it get used against the company. That's not something I can keep ignoring." "What do you want?" "Nothing." The voice was steady. "I want to give you the logs. That's it. You tell me how to get them to you safely and I'll do it tonight." Ethan looked at Celeste. She looked back at him. He saw in her face the same thing he was feeling. Not relief? Not yet, because neither of them was built for premature relief. But something that was the first solid ground they'd felt underfoot in 72 hours. "There's a coffee place," he said, "West Side, the Hargrove neighborhood, called Millstone. Can you be there tomorrow morning at 7:30? "Yes." "Come alone. Bring the logs on a physical drive." "Okay." A pause. "One more thing, the photograph that was sent to you, the one from your apartment building." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What about it?" "I know who accessed the building opposite yours. It routes through a facilities access account that I can tie to a specific user ID. It's not anyone from IT, it's..." The line went dead. Not dropped. Ended. From the other side. Ethan and Celeste looked at each other across the table. He had the phone pressed to his ear and she had both hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly, and the silence between them was not the comfortable working silence of earlier. It was the silence of two people who had just heard a door close that might not open again. He dialed the number back immediately. It rang 4 times and went to a voicemail that had no recorded greeting, just a beep. He ended the call. He put the phone down on the table very carefully. "She was cut off," Celeste said. "Yes." "Victor's people are monitoring communications. If they flagged her number making contact with yours, they moved to stop it. He was already standing. If they found her fast enough to cut the call, they know who she is, which means she's exposed." Celeste stood too. "We need to find out if she's all right. We don't have her name. We don't have anything except a voice and a number that's now dead." He picked up the phone again, stared at the number on the screen. "But she said she worked in IT. Ben Sato knows his team. If I can get to Ben before Victor does..." "Victor's people will go to Ben first. If they've identified her through the call log, Ben is the fastest way to confirm the name." Ethan looked at her. She looked back at him. The clock on the wall behind her read 12:17 in the morning. "I need to be at Ben Sato's apartment before whoever Victor sends," he said. "I'm coming with you." "Celeste, I'm coming with you," she said. And it was not a negotiation. They left the apartment together, moving fast, and the city outside was doing what cities do at midnight, loud in some places and quiet in others, entirely indifferent to the fact that somewhere in its grid, a young woman who had done the right thing had just had her phone line cut, and somewhere else a man who had spent 11 years building a structure of deception and erasure was making decisions about how far he was willing to go to keep it standing. Ethan didn't know yet how far that was. He found out 40 minutes later, standing outside Ben Sato's building on the east side, When Ben came down to the lobby door with his face the color of paper and his hands not quite steady, and said, in a voice that had been scraped hollow by something recent and terrible, "Someone called me 10 minutes ago and told me that if I speak to anyone about the server logs, my daughter's school schedule is going to become very interesting to very unpleasant people." The words landed in Ethan's chest like something physical. He heard Celeste go very still beside him. He kept his face controlled and his voice level and said, "Who called you?" "A man. I don't know his name. He knew my daughter's name. He knew what grade she's in." Ben's jaw was working. "I have a 7-year-old, Mr. Hale. I have a 7-year-old, and someone just called me at midnight and said her name." Ethan looked at him. He looked at the lobby behind him, at the ordinary institutional light of a residential building at midnight, at a man who had done his job correctly and reported honestly, and was now standing in his own lobby at midnight being told that honesty had a price. He thought about Victor Blackwood, who had a daughter he had erased from his own family tree, who had paid to alter her records, to remove her name, to make her effectively invisible in the state system, who had spent 9 years hiding the existence of a child because she was inconvenient, and who was now, apparently, willing to use someone else's child as a threat. Something shifted in Ethan then. Not anger. He was past the temperature of anger, which runs hot. This was colder than anger. This was the place you get to when you have been pushed far enough that the part of you that calculates risk stops calculating, and the part of you that knows what is simply not acceptable takes over completely. He took out his phone. He looked at Ben. "I'm going to need you to trust me for 48 hours, he said. "I know what you're risking. I'm asking anyway, because the person who called you tonight is the same person who erased a 6-year-old girl from her own legal identity, and if we don't stop him in the next 3 weeks, he's going to keep doing exactly this to exactly the kind of people you are." Ben looked at him for a long moment. His hands were still unsteady. His face was still the color of paper. Then he said, "What do you need?" And Ethan told him, standing in a lobby at midnight with Celeste at his shoulder and the whole enormous weight of the thing pressing down from above, that what he needed was everything, every log, every access record, every masked event, every piece of the thing that Kyle Marsh had tried to clean up before it could be seen, because they were done fighting defensively, and what came next was going to require them to stop protecting themselves and start. They worked through the night in Ben Sato's apartment. Ben's wife had taken their daughter to her mother's house 20 minutes after Ethan and Celeste arrived. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she'd looked at her husband's face and the faces of the 2 people standing in her lobby and made the calculation that mothers make when something in the air tells them the building is not safe. She'd packed a bag in 7 minutes flat, kissed Ben once hard on the cheek, and left without asking questions, which was its own kind of courage. Ben had the raw server logs on an encrypted drive that he'd been keeping at home for 3 days, since the night he'd filed his anomaly report and watched it disappear into Kyle Marsh's inbox. He pulled it out of a shoebox on the top shelf of his bedroom closet, the specific hiding place of a man who doesn't think of himself as someone who hides things and therefore doesn't have a better system, and plugged it into his personal laptop on the kitchen table. Ethan sat on one side of him and Celeste on the other, and the 3 of them went through 14 months of server access logs in 4.5 hours. What they found was meticulous and damning, and, in its own way, almost admirable in the coldness of its engineering. Kyle Marsh had not been sloppy. He had accessed files in small increments, never pulling large volumes at once, always routing his access through legitimate work functions that gave him plausible cover. He had masked 11 of the most critical access events by piggybacking them onto routine IT maintenance windows when elevated permissions were standard. He had been doing it long enough that the pattern had normalized itself into the background noise of a busy server environment. But raw logs didn't lie. Raw logs were the thing underneath the thing, the unedited record of what had actually happened before anyone had decided what the record should say. And the raw logs showed, with timestamps accurate to the millisecond, exactly what Kyle Marsh had accessed, exactly when, and exactly how much of it had subsequently appeared in Victor Blackwood's governance filings. By 4 in the morning, they had a documented chain of 47 discrete breaches going back to Kyle's 3rd month of employment. Ethan photographed every screen. Celeste made a list of the filing dates and cross-referenced them against Victor's legal actions in a handwritten column on a legal pad that Ben produced from a kitchen drawer. The correlation was perfect, too perfect to be coincidental, tight enough to be evidence. Ben sat back in his chair at 4:15 and rubbed both hands over his face. "This is enough to get Kyle fired," he said. "This is probably enough to get him prosecuted." "This is enough to get the governance inquiry thrown out," Celeste said. She was still looking at the screen, one finger moving along a column of timestamps. "If the inquiry was initiated using information that was obtained through illegal access of company systems, the entire filing is tainted." "Victor's attorneys will argue he didn't know how the information was obtained," Ethan said. "Let them argue it." She looked up, and her eyes had the particular quality he associated with her, at her most certain. Not hard exactly, but very clear, like water that's cold enough to see straight through. It buys us time, and time is what we need before the certification. "You need more than time," Ben said. He was looking at his laptop. "You need this in front of someone who can act on it before Victor can file a countermotion to suppress." He paused. "How fast can you get to a judge?" "Howard Chen can file an emergency motion for injunctive relief by 9 this morning," Celeste said. "If we can get this to him in the next 2 hours, he can have it before the duty judge by 8. Ethan looked at her. "Can you trust Howard right now?" A pause. A short one, but it was there. "Howard is the one person in this who has not failed me," she said. "Kyle, Rourke, possibly others I haven't identified yet. But Howard has been my grandfather's attorney since before I was born, and when someone contacted his office claiming to have the contract, the first thing he did was call me. Not Victor. Me." "All right." He stood up. His lower back had the specific ache of 5 hours in a kitchen chair, and his eyes felt like they'd been rinsed in something abrasive. "Send it to Howard, everything, the raw logs, the correlation chart, the timestamps." Celeste was already on her phone. Well, they left Ben's apartment at 5 in the morning. The city outside was in the particular state it only achieves between 4:30 and 6, when the night crowd has gone home and the day crowd hasn't started yet, and the streets have a quality of emptied-out stillness that makes you feel like you're moving through something that isn't quite real. A garbage truck went past 2 blocks north. A woman walked a dog on the other side of the street, looking at her phone. Normal things. Ethan and Celeste stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment, both of them slightly hollowed out from the night, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a second. "Go home," she said. "Get 2 hours. I need you functional today." "Same to you." "I'll sleep at the office. I have a couch." "That couch is terrible. I've seen it." Something moved across her face that was, briefly, almost a smile. "I've had worse." He went home. He lay on his bed for exactly 94 minutes, not sleeping the whole time, but getting enough of something adjacent to sleep, that when his alarm went at 7, he felt like a person rather than a collection of symptoms. He showered, changed, made coffee. He drank standing over the sink and was back in a cab at 7:45. His phone rang at 7:52. He picked up. "The motion has been filed." Howard Chen's voice, precise and unhurried. The voice of a man who had been navigating difficult situations for 30 years and had learned that urgency and calm were not mutually exclusive. Emergency injunctive relief requesting a stay of the governance inquiry pending investigation of the underlying breach. The duty judge is Harriet Wynne. She's reviewing it now. "How long? For a response? Anywhere from 2 hours to the rest of the day. Judge Wynne is thorough." A pause. "Ethan, the evidence package you've assembled is very strong, but Victor's attorneys are good, and they will file a counter motion within an hour of being notified. What happens next is going to be fast." "I know." "Are you ready for it to be fast?" He looked out the cab window at the city going past. "Yes." He ended the call. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, and then he did something he hadn't done yet this morning, which was call Riley. She picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant she'd been awake already, which either meant a good night or a bad one. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He kept his voice normal, the version of normal that he'd perfected over 18 months of hospital visits. "How are you feeling?" Medium. Better than yesterday. A pause, and he could hear the specific quality of her listening, the way she'd always been able to hear the thing under the thing. You sound like you've been awake since Tuesday. Something like that. Is it almost done? He thought about the motion before Judge Wynn. He thought about the server logs and the 47 documented breaches. He thought about Mara's photograph in the state case file, and Victor's name on a 9-year-old incorporation document, and a young woman whose phone line had been cut at midnight, and Ben Sato's daughter, whose name had been used as a threat, and the 4 words left on his desk that he hadn't told Riley about and wasn't going to. It's almost done, he said. Okay. She said it the way she always said okay, which was as a complete sentence that meant, I trust you, and also please don't lie to me, and also I know you're doing everything you can. Call me when it is. I will. He ended the call and pocketed the phone as the cab stopped in front of Blackwood Capital. Victor filed his countermotion at 9:47. Ethan found out through Howard, who called with the professional calm of someone reporting weather. The countermotion argued 3 things: that the server logs had been obtained through unauthorized removal of proprietary company data by a disgruntled employee, that the chain of custody of the evidence was irreparably compromised, and that the emergency motion was itself a delay tactic designed to obstruct legitimate governance proceedings. It was well constructed. Victor's attorneys were, as Howard had said, very good. They had taken the strongest elements of their opponent's case and reframed each one as evidence of bad faith. Ethan read the filing in Celeste's office, standing at her desk because she was sitting in her chair and there wasn't another one positioned for reading. He read it twice. Then he put it down and looked at the window. He's going to move on the board before the judge rules, he said. I know. If he can get enough votes to call an emergency session before the injunction is granted, he can push through a resolution on executive status that predates the court's ability to intervene. I know, Ethan. How many votes does he need for an emergency session? 6 of 12. She paused. He has 3 confirmed. Rourke makes 4. That's still too short. Garrison and Chu are undecided. She said it without inflection. He'll go to them today. If he reaches them before we do, then we go to them first. He straightened up. Right now, both of them. She was already standing. Philip Garrison was 67 years old, had been on the Blackwood Capital Board for 9 years, and had an office on the 38th floor of a building 4 blocks north. He was, in Ethan's professional assessment from 2 years of watching him in board meetings, a man who voted his conscience when his conscience was clear and voted his caution when it wasn't, which made him precisely the kind of person who needed a clear, unambiguous picture before he made a decision under pressure. They were in his office by 10:15. Celeste put the evidence package on his desk, the server logs, the correlation chart, Howard's legal summary of the breach, and stood back and let Ethan walk Garrison through it. Not because she couldn't do it herself, because Ethan was the analyst, and the way an analyst walks someone through a data package is different from the way a CEO does, and for Philip Garrison, that difference mattered. Garrison read slowly. He asked 4 questions, each of them precise, each of them the right question. Ethan answered all 4 without qualification. When Garrison finished reading, he folded his hands on top of the package and looked at Celeste. What do you want from me? I want you to hold your vote until the court rules on the injunction, she said. I'm not asking you to commit to a position. I'm asking you to give the legal process 48 hours before you respond to any communication from Victor requesting an emergency session. Garrison looked at her for a long moment. He was the kind of man whose face showed his thinking, which was unusual at this level of corporate governance. You're confident the injunction will be granted. I'm confident the evidence is sufficient, she said. He looked at the package again. He looked at Ethan. You built this. I assembled it. Ben Sato produced the raw data. Another pause. I've known Victor for 20 years, Garrison said. I've known he was capable of many things. I want to be honest with you. I don't enjoy being shown that I underestimated the extent of it. He paused. 48 hours. That's all I'm asking. They left Garrison's building at 10:50. Angela Chu was harder. She was 53, a former investment banker who had joined the board 3 years ago, And she had the particular type of intelligence that presented itself as skepticism about everything until proven otherwise. She'd asked harder questions than Garrison, and she'd asked them with less visible warmth. "Why are you bringing this to me now?" she said, from behind her desk in her own office across town, where they'd arrived at 11:30. "The governance inquiry was filed 10 days ago. You've had this evidence, the server logs, for how long?" "Ben Sato gave us the drive last night," Ethan said, "and the investigation leading to the identification of Kyle Marsh. Ongoing for several weeks. So you knew something was wrong weeks ago and you didn't come to the board with it then." "We knew something was wrong," Celeste said. "We didn't have evidence clean enough to put in front of a board member. Coming to you with suspicion was worse than not coming to you at all." Chu looked at her. "And now you have evidence clean enough. Now we have a documented chain of 47 breaches with timestamps that correlate directly to Victor's filings." "Yes." Chu picked up the correlation chart. She studied it. She had the reading posture of someone who had spent decades at close grips with numbers, and watching her absorb the document was a different experience from watching Garrison do it. Faster, more internal, conclusions forming behind her eyes without showing on her face. "The Crestline connection," she said without looking up. "You haven't included that in this package." Ethan went still. "How do you know about Crestline?" She looked up then. Her expression was careful and controlled, and had something underneath it that he couldn't immediately identify. "Because Victor mentioned it to me 2 weeks ago. He told me that you," she looked at Ethan, "had been conducting an unauthorized investigation into company financial structures using company resources, and that Crestline was the entity you'd been trying to connect to Blackwood Capital activity." He kept his face even. "He told you I'd found Crestline. He told me you'd been looking for it." The distinction landed precisely. Victor hadn't told Chu that Crestline was connected to him. He'd told her that Ethan had been trying to connect it to the company, making Ethan's investigation look like an attempt to manufacture a false connection. "Ms. Chu," Ethan said, "Crestline Asset Management was incorporated 9 years ago. The founding document, before multiple rounds of structural cleaning, lists a single member. That member is Victor Blackwood. The holding company has been used to fund legal representation in a state child placement case involving a minor whose DNA records were deliberately altered to remove her biological connection to the Blackwood family." He said it flat, precisely, without ornament. "Victor has a daughter. He spent 9 years making sure that daughter doesn't exist on paper. Crestline is the mechanism he used to pay for it." The room was very quiet. Chu set down the correlation chart. She looked at Ethan, then at Celeste, then back at Ethan. "Can you document that?" "The incorporation record is public, filed, and accessible. The connection to the child placement case runs through billing records and an access trail that my investigator established before I asked her to stop looking for her own safety." He held Chu's gaze. "I can document enough of it to establish the connection. A court-appointed investigator with full subpoena power could document all of it." Another long silence. "Victor called me this morning," Chu said slowly. "He asked me to hold a conversation with him this afternoon. He said it was about the board's options ahead of the certification." "He's building toward the emergency session," Celeste said. "Yes." Chu looked at her. "I had not yet decided whether to take the meeting." A pause. "I'm going to not take the meeting." They left her office at 12:40. Ethan stood on the sidewalk in the cold noon air and felt the tight wire of the morning begin, slightly, to loosen. "Garrison and Chu hold," Celeste said. "He can't call the emergency session without them." "He's going to know we went to them," Ethan said. "He's going to know within the hour." "Yes." "Which means he moves to the next thing." "The contract," she said. "If he can't get the emergency session, he releases the contract to the press. It doesn't remove me from power directly, but it puts enough pressure on the undecided board members that—" "Then we release it first," Ethan said. "Right now, today. We don't wait." She looked at him. She had her coat pulled against the cold, and her hair was doing the thing it did when she'd been inside for a long time, and then walked into wind slightly less controlled than usual. And she looked, in this particular afternoon light, on this particular sidewalk, like someone who was completely exhausted and completely certain simultaneously, which was a combination he had come to find unexpectedly moving. "Today," she said. "Howard drafts the cover statement. We put the contract in full, with your statement, directly to the board members and simultaneously to the financial press. Victor's version lands after yours, and it's just a copy of something you already released yourself. You own the narrative. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Write the statement with me." "Now?" "Right now, before we go back inside." She pulled out her phone. "Tell me what it needs to say, and I'll tell you if it's true." He stood on the sidewalk with her, and they built the statement in pieces. Him speaking and her correcting and sharpening right there in the cold with the city moving around them. It took 11 minutes. It was exactly honest, exactly right, and it would either save her or give Victor the match he needed, and there was no way to know which one yet. Howard filed the release at 1:47. By 2:15, it was on every financial wire that covered Blackwood Capital. By 2:40, Victor's phone had been ringing for 25 minutes, and his attorneys had filed an emergency objection to a press release they could not legally stop. And Diane Rourke had sent Celeste a text message that said simply, "I'd like to speak with you privately before end of day." Ethan read the text over Celeste's shoulder. "She's looking for an exit," he said. "Rourke doesn't get an exit," Celeste said, and the coldness in her voice was the kind that comes not from cruelty, but from the exhaustion of being betrayed by someone you'd trusted, and not having the energy left to pretend it didn't matter. "She might be useful," he said. "If she's looking for an exit, she might be willing to give us something to use against Victor directly, something that doesn't route through the server logs or the Crestline connection." Celeste looked at her phone. "What kind of something?" "Victor's been running a coordinated campaign for 11 years. Someone has been keeping records of it. The payments, the instructions, the communication chain. Kyle's not going to give us that voluntarily, but Rourke has board-level visibility," Celeste said slowly. "She's seen things Victor would never put in writing to Kyle." "Tell her you'll talk." A pause. Then she typed a response to Rourke's message. "My office, 4 o'clock." She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at him. "What are you doing for the next hour?" "I'm going to make a call I've been putting off," he said. She waited. "The young woman from IT who called me last night, the one whose line went dead. I need to find out if she's all right." Her expression did something subtle and serious. "How?" "Ben knows his team. If she accessed the call from a personal device, he might be able to narrow down who it was by the access pattern she described. The things she knew about the logs." He paused. "She took a risk to try to help us. I'm not going to leave that unaddressed." Celeste looked at him for a moment. "Go," she said. He went. Ben took 12 minutes to identify her. Her name was Jess Fahey. She was 28, had been in the IT security sub-team for 7 months, and when Ethan called Ben from a corner of the lobby where the noise was low enough to hear, Ben said, in a voice that was careful and controlled, and working to stay that way, "She called in sick this morning. She's not answering her personal cell." Ethan went cold. "Address." "I can't just give you an employee's boss, Ben." A pause. Ben gave him the address. She lived 11 minutes away by cab. Ethan was at her door in 14. He knocked, he waited. He knocked again, harder. The door opened. Jess Fahey was 28 years old, and she was standing in her own doorway with a cut on her lower lip that was no longer bleeding but was swollen and had been pressed with something cold recently. A bruise starting on her left cheekbone, and the specific steadiness of a person who has decided not to fall apart and is paying for the decision in visible tension across every muscle in their face. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm Ethan Hale," he said. "I know who you are. Are you all right?" "Define all right." Her voice was steady. "They came to my apartment at 12:30. 2 men. They didn't take anything. They just—" She stopped. "Made a point." His jaw was tight. "Did you call the police?" "They said not to." She held his gaze. "They also said the drive I was going to give you had already been recovered." She paused. "It hadn't. They thought I'd already sent it. I still have it." He stood very still. "Can I come in?" She stepped back from the door. He went in. He sat where she indicated. A small living room, neat, a plant on the windowsill that was doing better than Celeste's. And she went to a kitchen drawer and came back with a drive that was smaller than the one Ben had. A personal drive. the kind you bought at any electronics shop. She held it out. It's everything I could pull from my own access level before they locked me out this morning, she said. It's not as complete as the server room logs, but there's something on there that Ben's logs don't have. He took it. What? A communication thread, she said. Internal messaging system. Kyle Marsh to an external address, routing through a company alias. 14 months of it. She held his gaze. I found it 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it since then. A pause. The thread includes instructions, specific ones, from the person on the other end. Victor's end. I don't know whose end. The external address is masked, but the instructions reference board timelines, certification dates, and... She stopped. And a child whose records the external party wanted Kyle to access through the company's legal department archive. The room was very still. Kyle had access to the legal archive, Ethan said. He used it twice. I have the access logs. She held his gaze steadily. Someone wanted the child's records pulled from a legal file that Blackwood Capital's attorneys had in their historical archive. An adoption matter from 9 years ago. He looked at the drive in his hand. He thought about the 9-year-old incorporation document. He thought about a child whose DNA records had been altered. He thought about a man who had filed a governance inquiry using information stolen from his niece's company while simultaneously trying to erase his own daughter from legal existence. He stood up. I need to get you somewhere safe, he said. I'm not leaving my apartment because of them. Jess, I reported this through the right channels, she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who has made a decision and is not going to be moved from it. I did everything correctly. I flagged it. I documented it. I tried to get it to the right person. They sent 2 men to my apartment at 12:30 in the morning because I did my job. I'm not going to leave my apartment, and I'm not going to pretend they've won something. She looked at him. But I would like you to make sure that what I've given you gets used. It will be used. Promise me. He looked at her. He thought about Riley, who had found the file and asked him to follow the thread. He thought about Ben Sato's daughter, whose name had been said out loud at midnight as a threat. He thought about a 6-year-old girl in a state facility who had been deliberately unmade on paper by the man who had made her. I promise you, he said. She nodded. Once. The gesture of someone who has done what they came to do and is now going to hold the cost of it without complaint. He left her apartment and stood on the sidewalk outside her building and called Celeste. I have a second drive, he said. It has the communication thread, 14 months of direct instructions from Victor's side to Kyle, including references to Mara's records. A sharp silence, then, Get here, now. I'm on my way. Ethan. Her voice was different, not the cold precision, something underneath it. The judge ruled on the injunction. He stopped walking. And? Granted, she said, the governance inquiry has stayed pending investigation of the breach. A pause. We have 48 hours before Victor's attorneys file an appeal. He started walking again, faster. Then we need to have everything in front of the board before the appeal lands. Yes. Rourke's meeting is at 4. I know. Get everything Howard needs from Ben's drive and from the thread on this new drive to him in the next 2 hours. We need a complete evidentiary package ready to present to the full board by tomorrow morning. I'll call Howard now. One more thing, he said. What? Victor is going to know the injunction was granted in the next 20 minutes. When he finds out, he's going to accelerate whatever he has left. He paused, and the cold of the street pressed against his face. And somewhere a car horn sounded 2 blocks away. We need to be completely ready before he moves. We are ready, she said. And then, after a beat, we are ready, Ethan. He heard something in the way she said it. The particular quality of certainty, not as performance, but as something she actually felt. The weight of it landing differently because it was shared, because it was ours rather than mine. And he took it in and kept walking. He was back at Blackwood Capital at 3:40. Howard Chen arrived at the building 4 minutes later with 2 associates and a sealed hard case for the drives. Celeste met them in the lobby and took them upstairs. And the next 70 minutes were a controlled detonation. Howard and his team going through both drives simultaneously, identifying the cleanest evidentiary path, building the presentation package that would go to the board at 9 the next morning. At 4 o'clock exactly, Ethan stood outside Celeste's closed office door and listened to the silence on the other side, where Celeste was alone with Diane Rourke. He didn't listen in. He stood beside the door with his back against the wall and his hands in his pockets, and he waited. The way you wait when the thing is happening and there's nothing left for you to do in this particular moment except hold steady. He thought about the 4 words on his desk. She used you, Hale. He thought about Celeste on the floor of her living room surrounded by papers, and Celeste making coffee at 9:30 at night without asking how he took it because she already knew, and Celeste on a sidewalk at noon building a press statement in pieces with the wind in her hair, correcting and sharpening until it was exactly true. He thought about what it meant to enter an arrangement for reasons that were entirely practical, and find 12 weeks later that the reasons had expanded without either party authorizing the expansion. He thought about how you account for that in a model. He thought that you probably couldn't. The door opened at 4:37. Rourke came out first. She walked past Ethan without looking at him, her face composed in the way that faces compose themselves when the conversation inside has taken something away and left something else in its place. She went to the elevator. The doors closed. Celeste appeared in the doorway. She looked at Ethan. She gave us Victor's financial records, she said. Personal financial records, not company records. Personal. Victor's been paying her from a private account for 14 months. She has the transfer documentation. She kept it. A pause. She kept it because she's not stupid, and somewhere in the last 14 months she decided she wanted a way out. Does it give us what we need? It gives us everything we need. She held his gaze. The embezzlement from the company fund. She has the transfer chain going back 8 years, the payments to Kyle. The Crestline funding payments. She paused. And one more thing. He waited. Victor transferred a significant sum 14 months ago to an attorney in family law, she said, from the personal account. The transfer description reads legal consultation, estate matter. But Rourke found the name of the attorney in a document Victor left in a conference room 6 months ago, and she photographed it. Dempsey, Ethan said. Dempsey and Cross, she said. Yes. The circle closed. Every thread they had been following for 3 months, the server breach, Mara's records, Crestline, Kyle Marsh, Rourke, they all led to the same place, the same man, the same structure of control and erasure that Victor had been building for the better part of a decade. Tomorrow morning, Ethan said. Tomorrow morning, she said. Full board. Howard presents the package. We give them no room to delay. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The hallway was empty, and the light was the particular quality of late afternoon in an office building, fluorescent and neutral and completely indifferent to the fact that 2 people were standing in it on the edge of something that would either finish this or finish them. Go home, she said. Sleep. Be back here at 7. You go home too. She looked like she was going to say something about the terrible couch, and then she didn't. Yes, she said. All right. He rode down in the elevator alone. He stood in the lobby for a moment. He took out his personal phone and looked at it, and then he called the number that hadn't answered before, the number that had gone dead at midnight, and it rang twice. And then Jess Fahey's voice said, careful and steady, yes. The injunction was granted, he said. We have everything. The board meets tomorrow morning. A silence. Then, okay? Lock your door tonight. Already locked. He ended the call. He went outside. He stood on the sidewalk and looked up, briefly, at the building. 42 floors of his professional life, his contractual marriage, his unwilling entanglement in something that had turned out to be significantly larger than either party had anticipated when they'd signed their names on opposite sides of a glass desk in October. He thought, tomorrow it either ends or it doesn't. He thought, I have been in arrangements before where the outcome was out of my hands, and I have always found it unbearable, and I find it unbearable now. And that is something I am going to have to carry until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning when Howard Chen stands up in the boardroom and begins to lay everything. Ethan slept 4 hours and 40 minutes. He knew the precise number because he looked at the clock when he lay down and looked at it again. When he woke, and the space between those two moments had the quality of sleep that is too deep and too short simultaneously, the kind that leaves you more aware of your own body than you were before. The specific weight of your arms, the pressure of your own pulse in your throat, the way your chest moves when you breathe without thinking about it. He lay still for a moment in the dark of his bedroom and thought about 9 o'clock. Then he got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the building across the street. The 4th floor, northeast corner. Someone had stood in that window with a telephoto lens and waited. He looked at the window now, and it was just a window. Dark, ordinary, giving nothing back. He drank the coffee. He got dressed. He was in a cab by 6:40, check-in. Howard Chen arrived at Blackwood Capital at 7:15 with 2 associates and the hard case, and the particular expression of a man who had spent a career preparing for mornings exactly like this one and had never fully made peace with them. He set up in the small conference room adjacent to the boardroom. Not the large presentation room, the small one, the one with the long table and the windows that faced north and the chairs that were slightly too upright to be comfortable, which was either accident or design, depending on how cynical you felt about conference room furniture. Celeste was already there. She had come in at 6, according to Sandra, who told Ethan this when he came through the glass doors on 42 at 7:10, with the particular expression Sandra had learned over 4 weeks to read, as he needs to know where she is without asking anyone other than me. She was standing at the north window when he came in, which was not the habitual window stand. This was different. She was watching the street below with both hands at her sides and her shoulders at a height that told him she had been holding herself this way for a while. He closed the door behind him. She turned. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment didn't require it. They had built everything they were going to build. What happened in the next 2 hours was the consequence of it. "Howard, ready?" he said. "Ready?" "Rourke's documentation is in the package." "Everything is in the package." She paused. "Victor's attorneys filed the appeal on the injunction at 6 this morning. Faster than expected. His attorneys are excellent. Will the appeal affect the board meeting?" Howard says no. The stay is in effect until the appeal is ruled on, which takes at minimum 3 days. "We have the window." She looked at him. "Victor will be in that room this morning." He'd known that. He'd been carrying it since he woke up. Victor had a right to attend any board meeting as a major shareholder, and he would exercise that right, which meant the morning was going to require something specific from both of them. Not performance exactly, not the controlled public-facing version of themselves they'd been deploying for weeks. Something more than that, and harder than that. The thing underneath the arrangement. Whatever that was. "I know," he said. She nodded once, then she turned back to the window briefly, and when she turned back again, her face had settled into the configuration he associated with her at her most resolved. Not the cold professional composure, not the exhausted honesty, but a third thing that was both of those simultaneously, the face of someone who has processed the cost of what is about to happen and has decided to pay it anyway. "Let's go," she said. Nah. The boardroom filled between 8:45 and 9. Ethan sat to Celeste's left at the head of the long table, which was his position as her spouse at a formal board proceeding, a position that would have felt absurd in October and felt, this morning, simply like where he was supposed to be. Howard Chen sat to her right. The 12 board members took their seats, Garrison and Chu across from each other in the middle, Rourke at the far end with her hands folded and her eyes on the table. The 2 openly aligned Victor allies, Barrett and Hollis, on one side, with the posture of men who had been told to expect a victory and are beginning to sense the ground shifting. The remaining 6 members arranged themselves with the careful neutrality of people who had read the press release and the counter-statements and the legal filings and who were waiting to be persuaded by something definitive. Victor came in at 8:58. He came in alone, which surprised Ethan slightly. He'd expected the attorneys. Victor had left them outside, which meant he'd made a calculation, that attorneys in the room would look like defense, and he didn't want to look like defense. He was 62 years old, and he walked to his seat at the far side of the table with the ease of a man who had been in important rooms his entire life, and had never once walked into one believing he would lose. He sat down. He looked at Celeste. He looked at Ethan. His expression was the social smile, the controlled, benign, technically pleasant face that he deployed in public, and that contained, if you looked at it long enough and carefully enough, absolutely nothing human. Ethan looked back at him and held it, until Victor looked away first, which took approximately 3 seconds, and which Victor covered by reaching for the water glass in front of him. 3 seconds. Ethan filed it. Howard Chen stood at 9 o'clock exactly. "Members of the board," he said, "thank you for convening on short notice. The purpose of this morning's presentation is to provide the board with a complete evidentiary record relevant to 3 matters currently before you: the governance inquiry filed by Victor Blackwood, the November board certification of executive leadership, and a matter of financial conduct that the board has not previously been formally apprised of, but which bears directly on both preceding matters." He opened the hard case. His associates distributed bound packages to every seat at the table, including Victor's. Victor looked at the package in front of him. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at it the way you look at something when you need a moment to decide what your face should do. Howard began. He was methodical. He was precise. He was the kind of attorney who understood that the most devastating evidence presented calmly is more devastating than the same evidence presented dramatically. And he moved through the server breach documentation, the Kyle Marsh communication thread, the financial transfer records, and the Crestline connection with the unhurried pace of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. The board members opened their packages and read as Howard spoke. Garrison's face showed nothing. Chu's face showed nothing. Rourke kept her eyes on the table throughout, which was its own kind of statement. Barrett, one of Victor's open allies, raised his hand at the 12-minute mark. "I'd like to register an objection to the characterization of these materials as—" "You'll have time to respond," Howard said, without stopping. "I'd ask that you hold questions until the presentation is complete." Barrett sat back. He looked at Victor. Victor's face was doing something Ethan hadn't seen on it before, something that took him a moment to identify because it was so thoroughly controlled. It was the face of a man doing damage assessment in real time, calculating loss against option, finding the column that was supposed to come out in his favor, and watching the numbers fail to cooperate. Howard reached the Crestline section at the 20-minute mark. He laid it out the same way Ethan had laid it out in Chu's office. The incorporation document, the founding member, the connection to the legal representation in the child placement case. He said the case number. He said Mara's name. The room changed when he said Mara's name. It was not a dramatic change. No one spoke. No one moved visibly. But there was a shift in the quality of the silence, the way silence acquires texture when something enters it that everyone in the room understands to be significant in a way that goes past the professional and into something older and less managed. Ethan watched Victor. Victor's hands, which had been flat on the table in front of him, moved. Not much. 3 centimeters, a slight curl of the fingers, the involuntary contraction of a man whose body knows before his mind decides what the appropriate response is. He caught it and stilled it, but Ethan had seen it, and he thought, "That is the first true thing I have seen from you in this entire room." Howard finished the presentation at 9:47. He asked for questions. The next 40 minutes were the most controlled and most brutal professional exchange Ethan had ever witnessed, and he had witnessed a significant number of them. Barrett and Hollis pushed back on the chain of custody, on the admissibility of Rourke's documentation, on the framing of the Crestline connection as evidence of personal conduct rather than company business. Howard answered each objection with the patience and precision of someone who had anticipated every single one of them and had prepared for them specifically. Garrison spoke once, at the 30-minute mark. He said, "The correlation between the server access events and the dates of the governance filings, Howard, in your professional assessment, is this correlation the result of coincidence or of directed action?" Howard said, "In my professional assessment, coincidence is not a viable explanation for what this record shows." Garrison nodded and wrote something on the pad in front of him and did not speak again. Chu spoke at the 35th minute. She said, "I'd like to ask a question directly of Mr. Victor Blackwood." Victor looked at her. "Of course." "The Crestline Asset Management Holding Company. Are you prepared to address, in this room, your relationship to that entity?" A pause. Not a long one. Victor had been in rooms like this long enough to know that a long pause is its own answer. Crestline is a private holding structure that I established for estate planning purposes. It has no connection to Blackwood Capital. The financial transfers documented in this package, Chu said, routing from a personal account to Crestline to the legal representation of a child placement case. Are you in a position to explain those transfers? Another pause. This one's slightly longer than the first. I'd prefer to address those matters through appropriate legal channels, Victor said. You're addressing them through an attorney right now, Chu said. The question is whether you're willing to address them in front of this board. The room was very still. Victor looked at Chu, and then he looked at Celeste, and then he looked at the package in front of him that he had still not opened, and then he looked at his hands. It was a sequence that lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained in those 4 seconds the complete visible collapse of a position that had taken 11 years to build. He didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. But the board voted at 10:43. The motion before them was threefold: to formally dismiss the governance inquiry as tainted by illegally obtained information, to confirm Celeste Blackwood's executive leadership through and beyond the November certification date, and to refer the financial conduct matter, the embezzlement documentation, the Crestline transfers, the communication thread, to the appropriate legal authorities for investigation. The vote was 9-2. Barrett and Hollis voted against. Everyone else, including Rourke, voted in favor. Victor sat through the vote with his hands on the table and his face composed into something that was not the social smile and not the damage assessment calculation, but something underneath both of those, something that had no professional function, something that was just a man sitting with what he had done and what it had cost and what was coming next. When the chair announced the result, Victor stood. He picked up his copy of the evidentiary package. He straightened his jacket. He nodded once, to no one in particular, and he walked out of the boardroom without speaking to anyone. Ethan watched him go. He had expected to feel something specific when it was over, relief or the sharp release of tension that comes when something you've been carrying puts itself down. What he actually felt was quieter than either of those. He felt the stillness of a room after a storm has moved through it. The objects are the same objects. The light is the same light, but the air has changed in a way that takes a while to name. He looked at Celeste. She was looking at the door Victor had gone through, and her face had the quality he'd seen only a few times before. The thing underneath all the layers, the person who had sat on a couch in her apartment at midnight and talked about her grandfather's letter. She held it for 2 seconds, and then she turned to Howard, and the professional, composed Celeste came back into position, and she said something to Howard that Ethan didn't catch, because he was still sitting with the 2 seconds. The rest of the morning was logistics. Howard and his team spent 2 hours with Celeste building the documentation package for the legal referral. The embezzlement record, spanning 8 years of diverted company funds, was extensive enough that Howard said, in his measured way, that the authorities would have more than sufficient material to work with. The Crestline transfers and the child placement case documentation he handled separately, flagging it for the Family Court Division with a cover note that described plainly and without editorial what had been done and what it had left behind. Mara's case would be reassigned to a judge who hadn't seen the altered records. A court-appointed investigator would be brought in. The corrected DNA documentation, the original, unaltered chain of custody that had been held in Blackwood Capital's legal archive until Kyle Marsh had accessed it twice, would be reintroduced into the record. Ethan sat in on the first hour of that process and then stepped out because there was a call he needed to make. He went to the small conference room that was empty now, the one with the north-facing windows. He sat at the long table and called Riley. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey." Her voice had the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a call and has spent the waiting time calibrating how to receive whatever news it brings. "It's done," he said. A pause. Long enough that he thought about saying something else. Then she said quietly, "All of it?" "All of it." He heard her breathing. One breath, controlled, then a second that was less controlled, and then the particular silence of someone putting a hand over their face or closing their eyes. A silence that communicates what it's communicating through texture rather than words. The little girl, Riley said. Her case is being reopened by the right people, he said, with the right documentation. It's going to take time to resolve through the court system, but the records are clean now. Her name is going to be established. Another pause. Her name, Riley repeated, and something in how she said it carried all the weight of why she'd asked him to find her in the first place. The file flagged not because Riley understood the corporate complexity behind it, but because Riley had looked at a little girl in a state facility with irregular placement documents and had thought, this person should have a name that is real and belongs to her. Mara, he said. He heard Riley make a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then, that's a good name. It is. How are you? He looked at the north-facing window. The morning light was doing something clean with the clouds over the city. I'm okay, he said. I'm actually okay. That's not something you usually say and mean. No, he agreed. It isn't. She asked him to come to the hospital that afternoon, not urgently, just because she wanted to see his face rather than hear his voice, and he said he would, and he meant it, and he put the phone in his pocket and sat in the quiet of the empty conference room for another minute, looking at the light. He found Celeste in her office at 1 p.m. She was alone. The attorneys had gone, the associates had packed up, Howard had left with a handshake and the measured warmth of a man who is satisfied with a morning's work and is too professional to show more than that. The board members had dispersed. The floor was back to its ordinary noise, keyboards, phones, the elevator. She was sitting at her desk, not working. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she was looking at the glass surface of the desk. And when he came in, she looked up. Sit down, she said. Third time you've said that to me? You keep needing to. He sat. They looked at each other across the glass desk, which was where this had started, which was something they were both aware of, and neither of them said. Kyle has been suspended pending the investigation, she said. Security walked him out at noon. He didn't say anything when he left, which is... I don't know what that is. It's someone who knows when the accounting is complete, Ethan said. Rourke has offered her resignation. I haven't accepted it yet. What are you going to do? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet. She gave us Victor's financial records. She kept them because she wanted an exit, which is a self-interested reason and not an admirable one. But she also gave them to us, and she did it before she knew whether we were going to win. A pause. That's worth something. I don't know yet how much. He nodded. Jess Fahey, Celeste said. I want to offer her a senior position in IT security. Ben agrees she should be moved up. What she did... She'll take it, he said. She's that kind of person. Yes, Celeste said. I know. They sat for a moment. The afternoon made its sounds. Outside the window, the city was doing what it did at 1 p.m. Lunch crowds on the streets, a siren several blocks away going toward something they'd never know about. Ordinary life moving around the building in total indifference to what had happened inside it this morning. The contract, Celeste said. He looked at her. We have 7 weeks left on the 12-month term, she said. She said it evenly, the way she said things that mattered when she was trying to handle them correctly. The certification is in 2 weeks. After that, the clause is satisfied. After that, she stopped. After that, it's optional, he said. Yes. The words sat between them. He had thought about this moment, not often and not in detail, because he'd trained himself over the past 3 months to keep his attention on the immediate rather than the eventual, because the eventual was the kind of thinking that cost you something, and he couldn't afford to lose the cost. But he'd thought about it. In the moments between one problem and the next, in the cab rides, and the late nights, and the times he'd sat in her living room with the oversized plants, and the unread books, and the coffee she always made at the right temperature. He thought about what it would mean when optional became the word. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. She was good at waiting. She'd been good at it from the beginning. I came into this with clear terms, he said. I understood what it was. I understood what I was getting and what you were getting and where the lines were. And I meant to hold that, the clarity of it. It seemed like the responsible version. She said nothing. The problem, he said, is that you're not a contractual partner. You're a... He stopped. Not because he didn't know the word, but because he wanted to say it correctly, which was the thing that had always mattered to him about words, that they be accurate rather than easy. "You're a person I know," he said. "You're the person who told me about your grandfather's letter. You're the person who sat on the floor with papers around you, because that's how you think. You're the person who knew how I take my coffee before you made it." He looked at her. "I'm not performing that. I can't perform something I don't feel, and I've stopped trying to categorize it as within the terms, because it isn't." She was very still. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I'm not asking you to change the contract or extend it, or—" He paused. "I'm telling you what's true because you told me to tell you what's true from the beginning, and I've tried to do that, and this is the last piece of it." She looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't read her, which was rare now, which was the rarest it had been in weeks, which meant she was containing something large and was not sure yet whether to let it out. Then she reached into the right drawer of her desk, the same drawer the original contract had come from 3 months ago, and she put a document on the glass surface between them. His copy. The one he'd signed. She'd had it, he realized, this whole time. She put it on the desk, and she picked up a pen, and she drew a single line through both signatures, hers and his, and she put the pen down. He looked at the document. He looked at her. "I don't want a contractual husband," she said. "I haven't wanted one for approximately 6 weeks, if I'm being precise." A pause. "I want you to have the option to leave, and I want the option to be real. So the contract is finished." She held his gaze with the complete steadiness she always had, the steadiness that he now knew was not coldness, but something that had been built over a long time in the place where warmth keeps getting mistaken for weakness. "What you do with that is your decision." He looked at the paper with the line through their names. He thought about 4 months ago, standing at the window of his kitchen drinking cold coffee, carrying the weight of Riley's treatment and the second mortgage and the math that never came out right. He thought about the way the 42nd floor had felt when he'd stepped off the elevator the first time with the document in his jacket. He thought about the person he'd been trying to remain unchanged while everything around him changed. He picked up the document. He folded it once. He put it in his jacket pocket. She watched him. She didn't ask. "I'm going to see Riley this afternoon," he said. "She wants to see my face." He paused. "I'd like you to come." Something crossed her expression, genuine, unguarded, too fast for her to manage it, which meant she hadn't been expecting it and hadn't had time to decide what her face should do. "To the hospital. To meet my sister." He held her gaze. "She's the person who started all of this. She should meet the person at the other end of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "All right, I'll pass." They took a cab to Meridian Medical at 2:15. They sat in the back of it without talking very much, which had become one of their comfortable registers. The silence that wasn't absence but presence. The particular texture of two people who have been through something large together and don't need to fill the space between them with anything that isn't necessary. Ethan watched the city go past. He thought about Victor. He thought about what happened to a man who had spent 11 years building a structure designed to take something from someone else, and who had built it so carefully and so completely that when it came down all at once. Victor would face a legal process that would take time and that he had the resources to slow, but not to stop. The embezzlement record was 8 years of documentation. The Crestline transfers were clean and traceable. The governance inquiry had been dismissed as tainted. He would retain attorneys, and the process would be what legal processes were: slow, expensive, and in this case, inexorable. And somewhere in that process, the question of Mara would have to be faced, not by a legal system that had been corrupted by the money and the influence, by the man himself. In a courtroom, with the corrected records in front of him and a judge who had not been given an altered version of the truth. Ethan did not feel satisfaction about this. He felt something more sober than satisfaction, the recognition that this was what accountability looked like when it finally arrived, and that it was not dramatic, and that it was not enough, and that it was also necessary. Those things could all be true simultaneously. He'd learned that. He thought about Mara, 6 years old, a photograph in a state case file, a name that was her name, that had always been her name, that had simply been made invisible. It would take time. The family court process was what it was, but the record was clean now, and the biological documentation was reintroduced, and a court-appointed investigator who answered to no one with a financial interest in the outcome would determine what came next for her. He thought about what came next being something other than invisibility. That was enough for now. It had to be. Riley was sitting up when they came in. She had both earbuds out, which meant she'd been expecting them, which meant she'd been thinking about what this moment would be. She looked at Ethan first, and her face did the open gladness thing, and then she looked at Celeste, and the open gladness became something more calibrated. Assessment, the specific kind that Riley did with people she cared about meeting, the kind that was not judgment, but genuine attention. "You must be Celeste," she said. "I am," Celeste said. She stood beside the bed and looked at Riley with an expression Ethan had not seen on her before. Something open, something without any of the layers she usually maintained, as if being in this room with this person required a different version of her, and she was willing to provide it. "Ethan told me about you," Riley said. "Not the CEO part. The other parts." "The other parts," Celeste repeated. "The letter from your grandfather, the plants that outgrew their pots." Riley held her gaze. "The coffee." Celeste glanced at Ethan. He looked at the ceiling briefly. "I talked to her," he said. "She's my sister." "Apparently," Celeste said, and it was almost nearly the closest she'd come in his hearing, "warm." Riley looked at Celeste for another moment. Then she said simply, "Thank you for taking care of him while he was taking care of everything else." Celeste was quiet. He could see her absorbing the words, which had been said directly and without sentimentality, in the way Riley said the true things. And he could see Celeste deciding how to receive something that had been given without a transaction attached. "He took care of himself," she said. "Mostly I just tried to keep up." Riley looked at her for a moment more, and then she looked at Ethan, and the look she gave him said several things that were not words, all of them accurately targeted. He received them and said nothing, which was the appropriate response. He pulled the chair from the corner and another from beside the window, and they sat on either side of Riley's bed, and Riley said she'd been reading something she thought Celeste might actually find interesting, a financial analysis of the infrastructure investment patterns of mid-century American conglomerates. And Celeste said that was actually something she'd spent considerable time on in graduate school, and Riley said what graduate school, and the conversation went from there. Ethan sat back in his chair and held his coffee cup with both hands and listened to the two of them talk. They were very different. Riley all surface warmth and quick pivots, Celeste precise and slower to open but opening, as she did when she felt the room was worth it. And they were, in some fundamental way that surprised him and probably should not have, compatible. The same quality of attention, the same willingness to take ideas seriously, the same refusal to pretend something was simpler than it was. He listened. He didn't speak much. The afternoon came through the third-floor window in the way it always did, making the room warmer than it was, and his sister and the woman he had married in a municipal building for practical reasons were talking about conglomerates and infrastructure patterns with the ease of people who had found the right register on the first try, and outside the window the city made its sounds, and none of it asked anything of him for approximately 45 minutes, which was the longest it had been since October.
O assunto é...
They left at 4:30. Riley hugged him when he stood to go, which was Riley's habit, and she held on slightly longer than usual, which communicated what it communicated. He held on too. Then she let go, and he straightened up, and she looked at Celeste and said, "Come back sometime," without a crisis attached. "I'll try," Celeste said. "That's not a yes." "No," Celeste said, "but it's closer to one than maybe." Riley looked at her with an expression that was part amusement and part genuine respect. "I like her," she said to Ethan, in a tone that was not quite addressed to Celeste and not quite excluding her either. "I know you do," he said. They went down in the elevator. They came out into the late afternoon, which had gone gold and cold in the way late autumn afternoons go in the city, the light cutting sideways between buildings and making everything it touched look more solid and more temporary at the same time. They stood on the sidewalk outside Meridian Medical, and Celeste pulled her coat closed and looked at the street. And he stood beside her and looked at the street, and neither of them moved immediately toward a cab. He took the folded document from his jacket pocket, the one with the line through their signatures. He looked at it for a moment. Then he tore it in half and in half again, and he held the pieces for a second before he found a trash can on the corner and dropped them in. She watched him do it. "That was the only copy," she said. "I know. You could have kept it. The contract protects your financial arrangement." "I don't need the financial arrangement protected," he said. He put his hands in his pockets. "I'm not in an arrangement." She looked at him. The late light was on her face and her hair was down in the way it only was when she was not in the office, and she looked, in this particular light on this particular sidewalk outside a hospital where his sister was learning how to get better, like someone who had spent a very long time being exactly who she needed to be in order to survive and was standing on the edge of finding out whether there was room for something that wasn't survival. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "I don't know how to do this," she said. "The part that isn't the arrangement." "I know," he said. "I don't either." "That's not very reassuring." "No," he agreed, "but it's true, and true seems like the right place to start." She looked at him for a moment. Then she did something he hadn't seen before, which was reach out and put her hand over his where it was in his pocket. Not taking his hand, just the contact, the specific weight of a person choosing to touch another person without a practical reason. He turned his hand over and held hers. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, holding on. The city moved around them. A bus went past. A kid on a bicycle wove through the intersection at the corner. Someone laughed at something on the other side of the street. All of it ordinary, all of it continuous, all of it indifferent to the two people standing outside a hospital in the late afternoon with their hands together and everything they'd carried for 4 months behind them. "My sister is going to be fine," he said. "I know. The certification is in 2 weeks." "I know that too." "And after that, she said, "we figure out what we're doing." A pause. "Together, without a contract telling us." He looked at her profile, the line of it, the steadiness of it, the thing underneath it that he'd been learning to read for months, and would, he thought, keep learning. "Yeah," he said, "together." She looked back at him, and the expression on her face was not the professional composure and not the exhausted honesty and not the cold precision she used for hard information. It was something he didn't have a name for yet, something new, something that had been building so gradually across 4 months that neither of them had noticed it arrive until they were already standing in it. He didn't try to name it. He held her hand in the late afternoon light and let it be what it was, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was the thing underneath the arrangement that neither of them had planned for, and both of them were, finally, willing to keep. The city went on around them. The light shifted west. Somewhere on the 3rd floor of the building behind them, Riley was putting one earbud in and leaving the other out, the way she always did, watching something on her laptop while her body did the slow, uncelebrated work of getting better. Somewhere across town, a 6-year-old girl was sitting in a state facility on the edge of a process that would take time and that would end with her name being real and hers and connected to the people it was supposed to connect her to. Somewhere downtown, a legal process was beginning that would take months and would be ugly and would, in the end, make a particular accounting that particular men are not accustomed to facing. And on a sidewalk outside Meridian Medical, 2 people who had signed their names to an arrangement in October stood in November light with their hands together and nothing left between them that wasn't true. That was where the story ended. Not with a clean resolution or a bow on the difficulty of what they'd been through, because difficulty doesn't resolve that cleanly, and they both knew it. But with this, a hand held on a sidewalk, a document torn in quarters and dropped in a corner trash can, a sister putting an earbud in, the light going gold and then going, and the 2 of them still there,